David, welcome this afternoon.
Thank you.
David Lidington, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. We're very grateful to you for agreeing to come and give evidence to the Select Committee today. As ever, we have a lot of ground to cover and answers as succinct as possible while covering the ground would be much appreciated. Can I begin by asking you, just looking back at the cross-party talks, where would you say to the committee the government moved on its red lines compared to where the government was at the start of the talks as opposed to the end?
I think that the issues that very quickly became apparent would be the key elements were, I think, threefold. There was an issue over customs that from the start was controversial, where the government and the opposition began with very different positions about the preferred outcome. Secondly, there were issues about workers' rights. And third, there were issues to do with a second referendum, a confirmatory vote, however one labels it. There were other issues that came up too, on things like environmental rights and on UK participation in or relationship with EU agencies after exit. Those were less central to the debate. I mean, they did come up, they were discussed, there were the potential wording of agreements was talked about, but those three were the key issues. And I think from the government point of view, we felt that one thing, Chairman, I should stress from the start. I think for both sides of these talks, there was an understanding that this was conducted on a without prejudice basis.
Sure.
That from the government side, those of us who were in the room made it very clear from the start that if we got to the point where we could agree, we would then need to go back to Cabinet and see if what was acceptable to the opposition would be collective agreement. And I think you could ask Keir Starmer later on, but I think the same was true of the opposition, that their position was always without prejudice to a final shadow Cabinet discussion taking place. But I felt that on workers' rights and on customs, we did offer language which was a possible bridge. I think in the end, I think particularly on customs, it was a bridge too far. You know, it wasn't, or perhaps not far enough. It was more precise, more accurate. We couldn't get agreement on that. I think on workers' rights, we did come very close to agreement. On the second referendum, we were not able to get to agreement. I think the sense that I had of the Labour Party's position was that during the talks there was a shift towards greater insistence on the opportunity for a second referendum, and not just a vote in Parliament on that, as something that ought to be offered. I mean, we felt that that it was bound to be debated in Parliament whenever the implementation bill came through, and therefore there ought not to be a problem. It would be voted on. Parliament would take its decision accordingly. Now you can ask Labour colleagues about their position on this, but that again was something I think we certainly felt that we could not be in the position where we were actually advocating a second referendum.
Okay. Now, can I just take the customs union point? What was and is the problem from the government's point of view with a permanent customs union, given the position that the government has adopted throughout this process that it was friction-free and then it became as frictionless as possible trade? And given the Northern Ireland issue.
Yes. Well, the Northern Ireland issue, of course, was part of the negotiation on the withdrawal agreement, whereas the longer-term relationship over customs is something that was going to be part of will still need to be part of the negotiations on the longer-term future partnership with the European Union. The position that the government has taken, I think consistently on this, has been that the drawback of a full customs union with the EU is that it would, first of all, stop us from having an independent trade policy apropos third countries. Second, that it would, at least if it followed the precedent that has been set with the EU-Turkey customs union, oblige us on an unreciprocated basis to give preferential trade access to our markets to goods from countries with which the EU had negotiated a separate FTA, excluding the United Kingdom. And third, that there was an assumption, and I think this was, I'm trying to be fair to the opposition's position, this was in the Labour Party's position, that we would also be bound by the common commercial policy of the European Union, and that the EU would conduct negotiations with third countries on our behalf. And I think, in fairness, I think I'm giving an accurate description of the opposition's position is that they said, well, we should be able to do that while crafting some mechanism for having a say in how the EU negotiates with those third countries.
Okay. Now, you told the House of Lords Select Committee on the European Union on the 19th of June, you said the reason the political declaration was worded that way was that was as far as the Commission was willing to go on some issues, to put the context.
Yes.
Can you give us an example of an issue on which the Commission had said in the discussions on the political declaration, well, I'm sorry, but that's as far as we can go?
Yes, on justice and police cooperation. The Commission, throughout the negotiations, was very clear that, in their view, full membership or participation in such agencies as Europole was only available on their reading of the treaties to member states of the European Union, that we could therefore not expect the same access to those databases and legal instruments as even a close partner, but a third country, as we could as full members.
Right. So that's one example. Did they say that in respect of, I think it's paragraph 23 of the political declaration, which relates to trade and customs arrangements? What they said in terms of trade and customs is that they dislike the phrase frictionless, because their definition of frictionless is membership, because that brings a full participation in both the single market and the customs union. Okay. And that's why you have the formulation, which I think was a good formulation, about there being a spectrum when it came to future trade relationships, and that basically there was a spectrum, and it depended on whether you elected for greater national autonomy over trade policy or whether you gave priority to preferential access to the EU market in particular. Okay. Now, turning to the risk of a no-deal Brexit, could you briefly tell the committee what is the government's current assessment of the economic impact of that for the United Kingdom? Well, the overall, so the macroeconomic impact is as published by the Treasury earlier this year. So we stand by those figures that in terms of, insofar as one can predict, that there would be, in the event of a no deal, there would be an immediate shock to the economy, as the Chancellor has set down. Now, a lot then depends both on what mitigating measures are put in place here, but also the direction of future policy, not just in the United Kingdom, but in the European Union 27 as well. And that economic assessment shows that a no-deal Brexit would be the worst outcome. Yes, it does. And I think you then, Chair, need to also look at the microeconomic impact of this. And just to give one example, I was in County Fermanagh last Friday, and the businesses whom I met there used the word catastrophic to describe no deal.
And the sort of examples that they were giving were concerned how, in a no-deal scenario, their trade would be at risk simply because the EU from day one would be requiring businesses, customers and suppliers located in the Irish Republic to apply the obligations of the EU acquis. So, for example, a milk producer in Northern Ireland that sold milk regularly to a processing plant in the south would suddenly find that it would be unlawful for its buyer in the south to continue receiving Northern Ireland milk because that could not be certificated as complying with the relevant EU law. I talked to a company on Friday that said they send 60 or 70 trucks over the Irish border every day of the week, and that they're actually trying to. It's not just cameras and we have checks on the border, but it's the fact that you would have to comply with the various rules that the EU applies to any third country with which it does not have a negotiated trade agreement of some kind.
That's a really important point, because so regardless, if nothing changed at the border, there would be particularly felt in Northern Ireland because it's the land border and sure. Because trade has developed in a way where you have cross-border supply chains, including for very small businesses selling directly to a counterpart across the border. I mean, those same problems would arise, obviously, I think it's known from many public statements and publications, at other ports, and a lot would depend on how long it then took to get to a new equilibrium of a different sort of trading relationship with the EU 27. Okay, thank you. A very yes-no answer would help with this one. Do you think it would be acceptable to prorogue Parliament in order to prevent the House of Commons from taking a view on a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October?
No. I think all members in this place have the right to express their own opinions. I think it would be a constitutional outrage.
Thank you, that's very clear. Do you think if the House of Commons were to vote again, as it has done previously, to reject a no-deal Brexit, that any Prime Minister should respect that decision?
I think it's hard for me to put myself in the shoes of a potential future Prime Minister, and I think to some extent things depend upon the precise nature of the debate and the resolution passed and the circumstances there. But I'd have thought that any Prime Minister would be unwise likely to disregard the expressed view of the House of Commons, simply because the reality is that every government exists by virtue of the fact that it can command a majority in the House of Commons.
Okay, and if there were, and I accept this is a hypothetical question, but it's hypothetical circumstances, but there is a question about the Cabinet manual within this. Yep. If there were to be a vote of no confidence in the government over a no-deal Brexit and we were heading towards an election, is your reading of the Cabinet manual that the Prime Minister would be obliged to ask the EU for an extension so as to keep, in effect, the options open for whichever government was elected in that election, assuming it were after the 31st of October, to come back to?
Again, it is, as you say, Chair, it is a hypothetical question. I mean, normally, what would happen were a general election to take place for whatever reason, is that the government, from the moment of that announcement, would be in caretaker mode and not take decisions other than those that were, this is where there is a grey area, other than those that were absolutely essential to be taken at that time, lest taking those decisions prejudice the future government of whatever political complexion. But the exceptions, of course, we have experienced quite recently in 2010 when Gordon Brown's government had to take decisions about the financial crisis right up to the Sunday after the general election, when the government was in office, but the Conservative Liberal Democrat talks about forming a coalition, we're nearing a conclusion.
But quite specifically, I mean, the Cabinet Manual, just to remind you, it says that during the period we're talking about, ministers continue in office and it is customary for them to observe discretion in initiating any action of a continuing or long-term character. This means the deferral of activities such as taking or announcing major policy decisions. Now, is not writing a letter to ask for an extension to preserve the status quo for the incoming government, is that a major policy decision, and therefore wouldn't a Prime Minister, a caretaker Prime Minister in effect in those circumstances, be obliged to keep the status quo by applying for an extension?
It is self-evidently a major policy decision. I would probably have my private views on this as a Member of Parliament. Speaking on behalf of the Government, I think that we would say this is a hypothetical question.
Right. I'm glad you...
The situation is you have to keep the status quo. Parliament has already decided that we leave on the 31st of October. That would be a new policy decision that you're suggesting, completely opposite of the logic you're suggesting, sir.
Well, I was merely asking the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster what his view was, and I quoted the Cabinet Manual accurately.
But your interpretation was wrong, sir.
I was asking what the witness's
the witness
view was.
said he said it was a hypothetical question.
Well, he could have said that in answer to the question the first time round, and we're very grateful that you didn't, when you got into the highways and byways of the point that I was trying to make, because it could arise, maybe, and what the decision would be would have huge import for the country. But on that cheerful note, I will now ask Andrea Jenkins to come in.
Chair, so I'm quite which you're probably glad of, David. I've just got a few actually. Why do you think there's a lack of flexibility with the PM in changing their deal before sitting at the table with Labour?
I'm sorry, I beg your pardon.
Why do you think there was a lack of flexibility by the Prime Minister in changing her deal right up to the point that she sat at the table with Labour? Why was it having to wait until she sat at the table with Labour that anything was up for grabs?
I don't think that she has displayed a lack of flexibility. What the Prime Minister and the Government collectively had to face was the fact that we had negotiated an agreement with the EU27 that was very difficult to agree. It took a lot of time. It required compromises on both sides, and the Prime Minister believed and continues to believe that agreement successfully safeguards the key interests of the United Kingdom. And that we put it to Parliament. We put it to Parliament on a number of occasions, and there was a majority against accepting that. Now, what was not open to us was simply to go back to the EU and say we want to rip this up. It had been made very clear in both private comments from the Commission and the 27 governments, and in their public statements, particularly that from President Juncker after the additional protocols to the withdrawal agreement had been concluded in the late night meeting the PM had with President Juncker in Strasbourg, that they were not going to shift further. They had made, as they saw it, they had made a lot of compromises. It's ironic that Monsieur Barnier was severely criticised in Paris and other capitals for having, as those capitals believed, sold the EU short over the backstop. So that was not available.
Point, actually, regarding the backstop, when the committee was in Brussels, we interviewed Verhofstadt and Martin Selmayr. And I asked if the Prime Minister or anybody in the team had ever asked for the backstop to be removed, and their answer was no. What's your understanding of this?
Well, I can only speak for the period from when I've had my current office. and committee would need to ask Secretary of State or officials who were in office between 2016 and beginning of 2018 to get a view as to what happened at those stages of negotiations.
Was it ever discussed at Cabinet, for example?
No, the Cabinet we had to... The PM has made it very clear to the Commission and to heads of government that if the backstop were dropped, there would probably be a majority. But it had been clear from, I think, a very early stage, and certainly this crystallised in December 2017, that this was, in their eyes, something that, while they didn't want it, was an essential insurance policy for them. And it was not just about the Irish border, important though that was, and particularly for the Government of Ireland, but this was also about trying to reconcile the requirement for an open border on the island of Ireland with protecting the integrity of the European single market. And on a number of occasions in the negotiations, the focus from Sabine Whale and others was very much upon how do you protect the integrity of the single market. It wasn't about Ulster, it was how do we make sure that stuff from elsewhere isn't coming in. Back to my question,
David, was you aware of the Prime Minister ever asking for the backstop?
I know that she has raised that in conversation. I know she has raised that in conversations with other leaders. They were in no doubt. They were in no doubt at all that without the backstop there would have been a majority. But it was very clear, certainly from December 2017 onwards, that that was not something they were prepared to contemplate.
Okay, thank you. Would you agree that the government could have listened more to Conservative MPs when the withdrawal agreement was first rejected?
I think we were listening very much to the views of Conservative MPs and to MPs, and to, being frank, to MPs across the House, because we're in a House of Commons with no overall majority for any one party, and debating difficult choices on an issue which, throughout my time in Parliament and before, has divided both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. So I think knowing what the reports that we were getting back, in particular from the Chief Whip, but also from others, I think we were very alive to where different currents of opinion were.
Thank you. And just final question, if that's okay, Chair. So what offers were made to Labour during the cross-party talks?
Well, again, I must preface this by saying the discussions with Labour were on a without prejudice basis. So it was on the lines of, if we put these words forward, would that be sufficient for you to not just to vote in favour of the implementation bill on a second reading, but to ensure a safe majority to see it carried through all its stages? Okay. That was the nature of the conversation, but on that we tested various formulations on all the difficult issues, on customs, on workers' rights, and on second referendum. I think on second referendum we were prepared to commit ourselves to protecting time for a debate, because we just thought this was inevitable anyway, that there would be a debate and a vote on the second referendum. And the Labour Party wanted us, I think it's fair to say, wanted us to go further than that. We couldn't move on that, and we were not able to get to an agreement on customs either.
Did you ever offer support for the withdrawal agreement in exchange for a general election at a certain date?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Chair. I want to ask you some questions, Minister, about the intergovernmental structures with the devolved administrations. When the joint ministerial committee on European negotiations was set up back in October 2016, which I'm sure to you, like me, seems 100 years ago now, it had a specific remit, and I'm just reading out the remit, which was to work through, it says, through the JMC, brackets, European negotiations, the governments, that is, the British government and the devolved governments, will work collaboratively, first of all, to seek to agree a UK approach to and objectives for the Article 50 negotiations, and secondly, to provide oversight of the negotiations with the EU to ensure, as far as possible, that outcomes agreed by all four governments are secured from these negotiations. Now, it's fair to say that those objectives were not fulfilled, were they?
I think that when I took stock of this after taking on this role at the beginning of 2018, it was clear to me that there were some lessons to be learned. I think it's a matter of regret, I think, that JMCEN did not meet as frequently during the previous period as it probably ought to have done. I do think I would ask Ms Cherry to accept that there were some pretty basic differences of view between the UK government and the devolved governments in Scotland and Wales, respectively, on this. And we were also hampered by the fact that we didn't, except for a very short time after the referendum, have Northern Ireland ministers present after the collapse of devolution. But I would say, and so there's not been a common position on Article 50. I think the views of both the Scottish and the Welsh governments have been that their preference would be Scottish government more than the Welsh government, to stay within the EU. But then initially, I think the views of both governments, devolved governments, were to want to see something that was continued UK membership of both the customs union and the single market, and then that position has hardened over the last year towards support for a confirmatory vote or second referendum.
I mean, it's fair to say that the governments did not agree a UK approach. You know, you didn't take the Welsh and the Scottish governments with you in your approach, did you? There was no common agreed approach.
I think that we have made a lot more progress than is sometimes realised on the nitty-gritty of what arrangements should be put in place after exit, where Ms Cherry is completely right, is to say that there has not been agreement over the objective of the negotiations with Task Force 50, and I have never pretended that either First Minister or Mike Russell or Jeremy Miles or Mark Drakeford before him are signed up to the objective. But I think if you look at, for example, the work on common frameworks, that there has been a lot of very fruitful work where we've been able to say, notwithstanding our differences on the political objectives here, we need to make sure that in practical terms businesses can continue to buy and sell throughout the United Kingdom as powers are transferred back from Brussels.
But I mean, the red lines that the Prime Minister set out, those were never agreed with the Scottish Government or the Welsh Government, were they?
No, and I've never pretended they were.
And I mean, the second objective, to ensure as far as possible that outcomes were agreed by all four governments. I think it's fair to say that the withdrawal agreement was not viewed as satisfactory or agreed as a satisfactory outcome by either the government in Edinburgh or the government in Cardiff. That's right, isn't it?
That is right, but as I say, it's also the case that there's some fundamental differences of objective between the different governments there.
Now, I mean, you very fairly said that the process has not been ideal, and last year the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee of the Commons concluded that it was clear from the evidence to their inquiry that Whitehall still operates extensively on the basis of a structure and culture which takes little account of the realities of devolution in the UK, and that this was inimical to the principles of devolution and good governance in the UK. Now, that was a conclusion of a cross-party committee chaired by Sir Bernard Jenkin, hardly a bastion of the movement of which I am part. But I mean, that was their conclusion, wasn't it?
No, I don't. Actually, I thought that conclusion exaggerated things. I mean, there are flaws in the current process and the history of what's happened in the last 3 years, and I think it's important that whenever the next government gets on to phase 2, and in whatever circumstances, trying to negotiate a long-term agreement with the EU27, that we learn from that and we have a more productive approach. But I think where I would disagree with the excerpt from the committee's report that Ms Cherry read out is that I think, first of all, we have established, not just within JMCEN, but between departments in Whitehall and departments in both Scotland West and Northern Ireland good working relationships, so that, for example, when it came to DEFRA dealing with preparing the agriculture bill, the DEFRA officials and ministers have taken great pains to talk to their counterparts in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to try and make sure that we were taking account of the views and interests and specifics of agriculture in those parts of the United Kingdom. The work on frameworks, I think, has been successful. We are bringing back to UK jurisdiction something like between 150 and 160 different areas of EU competence, which also intersect with devolved competence once repatriated to the UK. We have managed to narrow that down to only about 24 where legislative frameworks would be needed, and we've now narrowed that down to just 4 where there are still some serious differences between the UK government and devolved governments over the right approach to be taken. Even of those 4, I think 2 are on fairly technical issues. We've set up a ministerial forum on EU negotiations that's co-chaired by junior ministers in Cabinet Office and DEXU. So that gives devolved administrations the opportunity to contribute in greater breadth and depth in priority areas to the UK negotiating position. And we've now also, as a matter of policy, invited the First Ministers or their representatives in their administrations to attend meetings of the relevant Cabinet Committee that is looking at exit preparations. So both First Ministers have attended meetings of this EUXTP Committee, when they've been unable to be there and devolved matters have been on the agenda, ministers from their administrations have attended in their stead.
The review that was announced by the Prime Minister when she was in Scotland recently, the Dunlop review of the interrelationship between Whitehall and the devolved administrations, is that purely a review of administrative procedures, or is there any intention for that review to make recommendations regarding policy change?
It's not intended to provide a peg on which to revisit the devolution settlement. It is, the terms of reference given to Lord Dunlop expressly say that one of the purposes of this review is to establish ways in which we can strengthen the devolved settlements. What we want the review to look at in particular is how we organise Whitehall, both in administrative terms, but also is how well adapted is the culture of work in Whitehall to dealing with the realities of devolution. So I would have hoped it's something that even parties committed to a different constitutional outcome might welcome and might want to contribute to.
That's very helpful. Are there any plans for any legislation to come out of that review, either primary or secondary?
There is nothing planned, but we'll have to see what Lord Dunlop recommends.
Okay. Just one more question. It's reported in the Scotsman today that the First Minister has said that Scottish Government civil servants have been deprived of key information relating to a no-deal Brexit by the UK government. Now, she was very clear that she wasn't criticising the British civil service. She was criticising the UK government as being at the root of withholding of information in relation to no-deal preparations. Now, you'll be aware that fairly extensive no-deal preparations are being made in Scotland by the Scottish Government's Resilience Committee in relation to various areas, but you'll also be aware that the Scottish Government feels that its hands are tied, for example, in relation to transport, because there's been no ability for the Scottish Government to plan for any key logistical areas, such as how much ferry capacity will be available after exiting the EU due to a lack of cooperation from the UK Government. Now, are you aware that there's this problem the Scottish Government are facing, that although they're advanced in their no-deal preparations, because they only have certain competences, there's only so far they can go, and that they are experiencing the withholding and the deprivation of key information that would enable them to go further? It's quite an important point.
I'm happy to give an undertaking that if the First Minister wants to supply details, then I'll be happy to investigate that and come back to her. But as I said earlier, Chair, the Scottish and Welsh governments at ministerial level now come to almost every meeting of the EUXT Preparations Committee, EUXTP. And while it would be wrong of me to divulge what happens there, I can say that those ministers play a very active role. And one of the benefits of them being there is that where something comes up where there's perhaps a particularly Scottish angle on, let us say, transport policy, they have the Secretary of State for Transport sitting there, and they can either raise the issue directly or flag it as something they need to take offline and sort out bilaterally outside that meeting. In addition, Scottish and Welsh government officials sit at every meeting of the official level equivalent committee on EU exit preparations. So there are, I would argue, ample opportunities for the Scottish Government to take up things that concern them. But I'm not aware, I can't recollect any recent occasion when Scottish ministers have said to me that they are seeking information and it is being withheld from them.
You see, just quickly, according to the information I have, Scottish ministers are concerned about a lack of information in relation to ferry capacity, not knowing what goods will be classed as priority and what arrangements will be made for Scottish needs, including the particular challenges of rural areas. But I'm happy to take on board your undertaking, which I'll pass on to the First Minister, that if she has concerns about any of these matters, she should give you the details and you'll get back to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pat McFadden.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for coming this afternoon. I want to ask you a few broader questions about Brexit and the Union. You've been quoted as telling the BBC a few weeks ago that you thought that the Union was under greater strain than you had seen in the past. This morning in the FT there's a report of a cabinet paper which has you saying there's a real risk of the UK breaking up in the event of a no-deal Brexit. You may not want to comment on a cabinet paper, and I accept that, but leaving that aside, can you just spell out for us why you are so concerned about the risk to the Union from a no-deal Brexit?
Yes, and I will, as Mr McFadden expected, I won't comment on the reports of what allegedly was discussed at a cabinet meeting. But I have said things on the record about this subject. My view is that the Union is under some strain in any case. I think that that derives in part from the fact that in Scotland, but I don't. I'll be fair to SNP members of this committee. There's a devolved government in Scotland that has, a quite open policy for which it seeks electoral endorsement of Scottish independence, and that, I think, as the First Minister has made clear, is the overarching strategic objective of the Scottish National Party and of the Scottish Government that the SNP leads. And that of itself, and the campaign underway now to try to press for a mandate for a second referendum on Scottish independence is a potential threat to the Union. In Northern Ireland, we have a situation where demographics have shifted. In Northern Ireland, you're looking at roughly equivalent proportions of the population who now identify as British and as Irish, with perhaps 12% or so in the middle, non-aligned, however one wants to describe their position. And we see those changing demographics reflected in electoral results. We saw in the most recent Stormont elections 2.5 years ago, for the very first time since 1921, no Unionist overall majority in amongst elected members at Stormont. We, at the European elections earlier this year, the highest number of first preference votes went to Sinn Féin. Historically, since direct elections to the European Parliament were introduced in this country, Northern Ireland has been represented under an STV system by 2 Unionists and 1 Nationalist or Republican. This time round, the second Unionist seat was lost to the leader of the Alliance Party. So there are changes there. And I think that, in addition, I think that in England, the polling evidence suggests that too many people, for my liking, are at best indifferent to the value of the union. And I think those of us who are unionists haven't made a strong enough positive case in any part of the UK for the union. We need to. If I look at how Brexit has an impact on that, the fact that 2 of the 4 nations voted to leave and 2 to remain sets up an inevitable tension in how we manage things. The fact that that allied to the changes in the politics of the different home nations has produced strains. For Northern Ireland in particular, the border, of course, while it has an important economic significance, is critical to conceptions of identity and has a history of recent years that arouses all sorts of fears, including of civil disorder, very, very quickly. That is at the back of people's minds. Even now, you go to any border area, you find that. So I think the strain is that even in Wales, which I haven't mentioned, I mean, Plaid Cymru got one of its best ever votes at the European elections recently, and the First Minister of Wales has said this week that in the event of Scotland voting for independence, Wales would have to consider its position. Now, we'll have views around this table about the desirability and the practicality of that, but I thought the fact that a Welsh First Minister who is himself a unionist said that was pretty significant.
Why, you've said, and Mark Sedwill has said, that a no-deal Brexit would necessitate the reintroduction of direct rule in Northern Ireland. Why is that the case? In the event of a no-deal exit, decisions would need to be taken very rapidly and for a period of some months at least on an effective legal basis. The absence of Stormont means that there is no effective legal basis for those decisions. In the position of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, first of all, is that it has far fewer autonomous powers than officials normally do in the various nations in Great Britain. So, for example, even planning decisions in Northern Ireland are taken by ministers in the executive, not by local authorities in Northern Ireland, because of the history of Northern Ireland local authorities being sectarian in one direction or another. So in the absence of the executive, now 2.5 years, the Northern Ireland Civil Service says that it can only take decisions within a mandate set by the last lot of Northern Ireland ministers. And without new primary legislation, no Secretary of State, including the Northern Ireland Secretary, can direct the Northern Ireland Civil Service to act in particular ways beyond that mandate set, insofar as one was set by the last set of Stormont ministers. That hands-off position was reinforced by a court judgment in Northern Ireland about a year ago, the Buick judgment, which ruled that the Northern Ireland Civil Service could only act in the most restricted way possible. The particular case was about the location of an incinerator and planning permissions for it. But the courts interpreted the law in a very restrictive fashion, and that's why the government then introduced and Parliament took through the Act to give the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland some limited powers to issue guidance to the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and we voted in the Commons yesterday to extend those powers for a few more months. But in the event of a no deal, the decisions that might have to be taken would be of a much higher order, and they would require much more explicit powers of direction. So there would need to be either some new statute to give powers to the Secretary of State, or
I think our feeling is it would need to be something that involved Westminster, or we might need to have emergency legislation for Northern Ireland on more than one subject, depending upon the actual outworking of a no-deal exit.
I mean, reflecting on this debate as a whole, without pinning blame on anyone, do you think the debate has concentrated too much on issues of trade, tariffs, economics in general, if you like, and maybe not enough on what you're really describing as an existential threat to the future unity of the UK itself?
I think that the trade and tariffs and prosperity issues are very important, and they matter a great deal to individuals and businesses in all our constituencies. But I think that the potential impact of that scenario on the United Kingdom has not been given sufficient sort of focus in the public debates about this now.
So, wouldn't it be the ultimate tragedy if, in the pursuit of an objective of taking back control to the United Kingdom, we found that we didn't have a United Kingdom in which to take back control?
Yes, I agree completely with that. And I think it's something that is a view that I think very much lies behind the stance the Prime Minister has taken on this, particularly in recent months. Now, I believe that the United Kingdom and members of the United Kingdom continues to have value whatever the circumstances of our exit from the European Union, and I will continue, whatever else happens, to make that argument. But I do think that the unity of the United Kingdom will be under greater challenge in the event of a no deal than if there is an orderly exit with a transitional period.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Brad.
So can I start by asking you, as somebody who I know cares deeply about morale within the civil service, can you give us a sense today of the current mood within the ranks of Whitehall in the context of Brexit? How bruising a period has it been over the last 2 to 3 years as we've tried to wrestle with Brexit?
I think that has been very difficult because the civil service has been running pretty much with the machine on red for, I think, at least the last 2 years. This work has come on top of everything else that we ask our officials to do. It has required, in some cases, the transfer of people temporarily into different roles. The reality of the need to prepare negotiating positions, sometimes at short notice for a live negotiation, has made civil servants work very hard indeed. So I would say that it has meant the civil service has been under huge pressure, and of course it has happened at a time when, for reasons which I suspect Mr. Crabb too would defend, the size of the civil service has been reduced quite significantly. And so, yeah, there's been a lot of pressure. I think what that makes even more important is that elected politicians of whatever political colour avoid making personal attacks on named civil servants who are unable to answer back. I think politicians should have the guts to criticise ministers or shadow ministers to their face and not take it out on officials.
Have you personally, in your work, in the time that you've been in this post, encountered any cultural bias within the civil service that's sought to, if not block, then frustrate or be an impediment to the smooth running of the Brexit process?
No, not at all. What I have had, and I would expect to have, is officials come to me and pointing out practical challenges and difficulties that would have to be surmounted to obtain a particular objective. And I found civil servants saying, well, we've got this, that they might have a a plan worked out, and then the ministers might say, well, sorry, but we think for these reasons it's not actually going to get through the House of Commons, so you need to take that away and try again. But I've whatever the personal feelings of any civil servant might be, I have not at any time since the referendum come across cases where civil servants have tried to frustrate the policy of the government in delivering that referendum result.
Given what you said in answer to my first question about the bruising experience it's been for Whitehall in some respects, do you think that the civil service, but I'm thinking particularly at a very senior level, the way it works, its processes, its norms, its conventions, can survive Brexit?
I mean, I think it would be wrong to say that the way in which the civil service is organised, the way in which its culture is framed is perfect. Every human institution has its flaws, and the civil service. I mean, the late Lord Hayward, in particular, was always insistent that the civil service had to be constantly looking for opportunities to renew itself, to adapt to the changing nature of British society and of political developments. And he sought to improve professionalism across the civil service, an agenda that his successor is seeking to carry through. But what I hope we do not lose is the basic principle that it is the duty of the civil service and the professional duty in which they take pride to do their very best to implement the policy of the elected government of the day and then of the particular ministers whom the PM of the day gives to them in one department or another.
One last question, Mr. Chairman. And you don't feel that ethos, that important ethos, is creaking today in the wake of the resignation of Sir Kim Darroch?
I think it is. I think that morale in the senior ranks of the civil service, and certainly today in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in particular, will have taken a very heavy blow. I thought, I have no idea who leaked those communications from Sir Kim Darroch, or what particular malice motivated that individual or organisation. I am frankly enraged by what happened. I hope that the culprit or culprits are found out and subjected to appropriate disciplinary and, if it is appropriate, legal sanction too. And I hope that we can sort of make every effort to restore civil service morale. I just think the quality of government suffers if officials feel that they should be inhibited from giving frank advice to ministers. And sometimes that means a frank assessment of the view of the approach of a foreign government or international organisation. At other times it might mean coming to a minister and saying to that minister something that the official knows the minister will find very unwelcome. Now, I've always tried to take the view when I've had the privilege of holding ministerial office, that ultimately it's my decision whether I drive the car off the cliff. But if my civil servants see me heading towards Beachy Head, I do actually want them to come and tell me that, not just leave it to me. It's up to me whether I accept or reject their advice, and then to be accountable to Parliament for those decisions. But their job is to give me the frankest advice, the most honest advice possible, whether it's something that I would welcome hearing or not.
Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister. I just wanted to go back to this subject of the cross-party talks. And you set out, I guess, some of the way that the government interpreted Labour's priorities and objectives going into those talks. Do you feel that the Labour side entered into those talks in good faith?
Yes, I do. Not only because that's what they said to us directly, but there were 8 plenary meetings of the 2 negotiating teams. in addition to separate meetings between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and what we term working groups, where particular ministers and shadow ministers went off and tried to resolve one or two dossiers outside the plenaries. And those meetings usually took a couple of hours apiece, so there was a lot of senior level time, energy, not to mention the preparation by our officials and advisors, which I think means people were taking it seriously. There was certainly, particularly at the start of the first meeting, there was quite a lot of feeling our way, I think, from both sides, because this was not the sort of scenario that any of us were used to. It's not between the two big parties at Westminster, but I think that the intentions were serious on both sides.
When you look at the product, I guess, of the talks, which was the withdrawal agreement bill, even though the talks had collapsed, but I think a couple of days later, the government published the withdrawal agreement bill. There was a sort of list of those 10 points summarising what had shifted and changed. Do you think that the government had moved to a place where it would have been reasonable to expect the Labour side to accept what was, in the end, the content of the withdrawal agreement bill as proposed by the Prime Minister? I mean, I think obviously it's important to focus on these words, yes, good faith and reasonable, yes, which are quite subjective terms. But in terms of as you say, quite a distance between, yep, the two sides, the negotiations, the product which was put on the table, are you disappointed by Labour's decision not to accept the terms of the withdrawal agreement bill and to reject it? Yeah. And do you feel that was a reasonable decision that Labour made? I
mean, that last question, I think, is one to put to my Labour counterparts. But I thought, to answer Mr. Kinnock's sort of question, I thought that we had made a good offer. I think it would not have been reasonable to expect the government to go further on a confirmatory vote than to guarantee parliamentary time at committee for stage, that. Yeah. It could be committee of the whole House or both committee and report. I think our private view was that it seemed unlikely that time we were having those talks that there would be a majority for a second referendum. I might have been right or wrong about that assumption, but we thought the right way forward was for the House to come to a decision, not for the government to change its position. On customs, we felt that both sides actually were wanting what we termed sometimes the benefits of a customs union. You have trade between UK and the EU without tariffs, without quotas, without rules of origin declarations and bureaucracy. Where we differed was that the government believes that we can do that and still have the freedom to pursue an independent trade policy. It obviously would be affected by whatever we had agreed in practice in phase 2 with the EU, whether future FTAs were compatible with that. But we could have that additional freedom, whereas I think the Labour Party view was that the better way forward, their judgment for the country, was to be part of EU negotiations and to try to construct some kind of say for the United Kingdom in those. Now, we had our views on how practical that objective was. I think each side probably said the other was asking for something that it was not practical, could not be achieved. But that's where those in summary, I think, where the key differences were.
Thank you. And did you provide the Labour side with written proposals and written material to support the negotiations?
Yes.
And what was the content of those documents?
We set out at different stages. We proposed different formulations. We also tried to craft position papers that we thought, might represent where there was a landing ground between the two sides. Now, Labour Party will then come back and sort of critique some of this, so we actually might be happy with this line, but this bit, we don't think fairly represents where we're coming from. So yeah, but there were documents that were. These were, as I say again, these were not things that had cabinet or shadow cabinet approval. These were, if you like, working negotiating papers, because some of we were into a discussion that involved legislation, that involved possible changes to the political declaration that we might seek jointly from the European Union. And therefore, there's no avoiding the need to set words down on paper so that everybody's clear about what is or is not proposed.
Would you be prepared to share those papers with the committee?
Well, I think what I would say is that if, after this meeting, if the chair were to write to me formally after committee discussion, I would consider that I would need to. The qualification I must say is that these were, treated by both sides as confidential talks. I don't think that we did not either side, I think, set out to leak what was in those papers. So I think I would want to talk both to Labour representatives, but also to those other ministers who are on the negotiating team, just to see what we could provide. But I would seek to be as helpful to the committee as I could be.
Well, subject to the chair's confirmation, I think it would be very useful and interesting to see those papers. One final question on the this issue of the customs union. I mean, what was finally proposed in the withdrawal agreement bill, in essence, is a customs union in all but name until the general election. So the deal was, of course, you go into the next general election and each party would be welcome to take a position on the customs union, put that into its manifesto, and Labour may well campaign for a more permanent and off-the-shelf version of the customs union. The Conservative Party might do something else. I mean, that is a reasonable position, isn't it, to say, well, in essence, it's this is a compromise whereby we make this arrangement to enable us to leave the European Union with a deal, but of course there is a general election coming at some point, and the two parties can campaign on a different platform should they wish to do so. That's your understanding of what was being proposed.
That's right. It was in effect saying to the opposition that we can't completely bridge the differences between us. So part of the solution is let's leave with the deal, and as Mr. Kinnock says, it is the formulation that we agree is framed in such a way as to give each party the opportunity to seek a mandate for the particular model of a future customs relationship with the European Union that party prefers.
Thank you very much.
Just on that point, since under the withdrawal agreement, and if the transition period went to December 2022, which is probably likely, but we can debate that, since we would have been staying in a customs union in effect anyway until December 2022, how exactly was that an offer of something different to what was already in the withdrawal agreement?
Because it is not guaranteed, of course, that the transitional period would be extended to December 2022. It is not you'll recollect, Chair, a unilateral United Kingdom decision. This is something that requires EU agreement if we were to extend rather than to go into the backstop, and it could be under the withdrawal agreement. The transitional period could be extended for either 12 or 24 months.
Okay, Seema Malhotra.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for coming to give evidence to us today. I have a slightly different area of questioning to ask you, and it's really around the Constitution and some constitutional matters. The Conservative Party is clearly conducting its leadership contest at the moment, and it's expected that there will be a new Prime Minister on the 24th of July. But very recently there was a Constitution Unit article written by Meg Russell and Robert Hazel, who suggested it isn't necessarily the case that whoever wins the contest would be automatically the Prime Minister. And that the Cabinet Manual states that if the Prime Minister resigns on behalf of the government, the Sovereign would invite the person who appears most likely to be able to command the confidence of the House to serve as Prime Minister and form a government. Do you think that it's possible that, with the uncertainty surrounding our politics at the moment, there may be an alternative outcome to this linear process as expected? Do you think the Queen particularly could make a provisional prime ministerial appointment conditional on a new Prime Minister demonstrating that they have the confidence of the House?
There's a number of intriguing questions wrapped up in that question. First, taking Ms Malhotra's last point to me, I do think it's a really important principle that senior elected politicians of all parties do their utmost to keep the sovereign out of politics. And therefore, I think anything that talked about in constitutional theory, it would be the Queen who would, I think, to use Ms Malhotra's words, ask someone to take office conditionally. I think that it would be very wrong to expect a constitutional sovereign to take that decision personally, rather than there being a political consensus that a particular course of action was the right one to follow. I think to go to the main thrust of the question, the key phrase is that quoted from the Cabinet Manual, that the outgoing Prime Minister has a duty to advise Her Majesty on the person who is most likely to be able to command majority in the House of Commons. Now, it seems to me that I don't want to speculate too much, but it seems to me that that is a decision that must weigh up whether one individual rather than another has the best chance of forming a majority, and for anyone other than the new leader of the biggest party to do that. It seems to me that they would have to provide some pretty compelling evidence that there was a majority behind them, not just a narrow majority, or this House of Commons, no guaranteed overall majority for any Prime Minister of any political party, without some kind of agreement from other parties in the House.
Well, there has been some concern, hasn't there, that if the new Prime Minister, assuming that that is indeed the case on the 24th of July, seeks to take the country towards no deal, and that there are colleagues who may choose to resign their positions and potentially their whip to take a stand against that, that in the period between July and September there may not be a majority in place. What do you see constitutionally as happening then? Do you think that there would need to be a vote of no confidence to seek to confirm that the Prime Minister has the confidence of the House?
The Queen's government has to be carried on. So if the Prime Minister goes to resign on the 24th, then the Prime Minister has the obligation to advise Her Majesty about the person most likely to provide, to be able to form a majority in the House of Commons. Now, a newly appointed Prime Minister can voluntarily decide to seek parliamentary endorsement. That is a matter for the new appointee. It is, of course, open to the House to invoke the provisions of the Fixed Term Parliament Act 2011 at any stage that the House, and in particular the Leader of the Opposition, chooses to do that.
So could it be conceivable that, say there is a vote of confidence, that you could then see the Sovereign potentially suggesting perhaps to the Leader of the Opposition to see whether the Leader of the Opposition, for example, may have a coalition that could be built across Parliament.
I think that this is taking us into different territory from that we would be in with the change of leadership of the Conservative Party that is coming in the next couple of weeks. If we're looking at a scenario where there has been where a no confidence motion, as laid down in the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and that point is important, has been carried, then the 14 days provided for the Fixed Term Parliament Act start to run down. And if after 14 days the House has not passed a motion in terms specified in the Act to express confidence in Her Majesty's government, then a general election follows. Now, of course, what happens in that 14 days is untested. This is like Article 50, really. It's a bit of constitutional law that no one has yet tested in practice. But, of course, you would have an incumbent Prime Minister who would have the duties under the Cabinet Manual as regards advice to the Sovereign. Now, anything I say about this is speculative, but it would be, obviously it might be that the Prime Minister at the time would seek to find a way to assemble a majority to be able to present a motion of confidence. It is possible that an incumbent Prime Minister could go to the Palace and say, I now have to resign, but there is this man or woman who I now believe is the most likely to be able to command the majority, and advise you to send for him or her. But that is, I think, about as far as one can go in terms of speculation, because it so much depends on the precise political circumstances.
Just one final. So, what would your role as the Minister for the Cabinet Office be in that scenario? And just to slip in a final question, because it's obviously the timing is interesting. If there was a vote of no confidence and then the 14 days ran down and then there was a general election and there's 5 weeks, we could be in a general election period through October the 31st when we would be leaving the EU. What would you see as needing to happen in that scenario? Seek an extension, and would that be the Prime Minister?
I think, if I may say so, I think Mr. Malhotra is vaulting over several fences in sort of talking about my role in such circumstances. But I think the Cabinet Secretary clearly has an important role in advising the Prime Minister about duties under Cabinet Manual, just as Her Majesty's Private Secretary has an important role in constitutional affairs. But this takes us back to the Chair's question at the start of our session as to what is required of an incumbent Prime Minister in the event of a general election being triggered. And certainly the convention that's been established hitherto and is reflected in the Cabinet Manual is that if a general election is called, whether triggered by Fixed Term Parliament Act or whatever is, or because Parliament gets the end of its term, the government from that moment on goes on to a caretaker basis and does not take any significant decisions that would prejudice the freedom of decision taking by whichever government the people elect.
Okay. Now, I think Peter Bone had a very quick question in relation to this point, and then I'm going to bring Stephen Timpson.
I mean, it is hypothetical, Chairman, but say Boris Johnson was elected by the Conservative Party to be its new leader, and the Prime Minister was heading to the Palace on that Wednesday. But she's advised that 30 Conservatives are about to resign the whip. Is it possible that on her way to the Palace, she'll think, my goodness, he won't control a majority, and there's only one person left who might do that, and it would be a Mr. David Lidington. And is there any possibility of us having a Prime Minister Lidington?
I don't know. You know what bets Mr. Bone has placed. That he's trying to sort of bring to a happy conclusion for him. But I think it's an extraordinarily hypothetical question. I think the best assurance I can give to Mr. Bone is that I am not finding my sleep interrupted by those speculations.
Well, we're all reassured to hear that. Now, Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Chair. I also want to ask some questions what might happen between now and the 31st of October. And I want to ask this, in your judgment, how much scope is there for renegotiating elements of the deal that's on the table at the moment? The current Prime Minister has negotiated between now and the 31st of October.
Well, of course, the European Council decision to grant the extension to 31st of October includes a sentence to the effect that both the EU and the United Kingdom agree that the withdrawal agreement cannot be reopened. I have heard nothing since that European Council meeting in any conversation I've had with either somebody from another European government or institution or from those who talk to people around European capitals to suggest that that position has changed. What I think is the case is that the EU remains open to discussing potential changes to the political declaration. It is conceivable, I don't know whether it would happen in practice, it's conceivable that the EU would be prepared to discuss some kind of further protocol to the withdrawal agreement. But I can't guarantee that. And I think the other thing is that what European interlocutors have said to me on many different occasions is that they want, when the new Prime Minister comes, they will give the new Prime Minister a hearing. They're very clear about that. But they also want to know just not only what is it you, Prime Minister, want from us, and is it something we can accept, but if we were to make that step, will that definitely provide an assured majority in the House of Commons? Because I don't think that the EU27 are going to be prepared to, as they would see it, make further concessions unless they can be very confident indeed that that would produce a parliamentary majority.
Well, it's my impression that both the contenders for the leadership of the Conservative Party are saying they will change the withdrawal agreement before the 31st of October. But I think you're saying to us it's clear to you that cannot happen.
Well, it's clear that there is a legal decision in the form of the European Council decision that does have legal effect, that the withdrawal agreement cannot be reopened. As I say, there are ways, protocols, if the political will is there, to go further than that. But I think there is an impatience, frankly, in the other 27 capitals about how long this is all taking. We saw that with President Macron's approach to the last European Council. We've seen it in the Taoiseach's public comments in the last few weeks. My view is that as best I can read it, the other 27 governments still regret the 2016 referendum outcome, but they know they have decisions to take as a community of 27 member states that they need to get on and take. And so I don't think it is guaranteed that whatever stance a new British Prime Minister takes, that the other 27 would unanimously agree to a further extension beyond October this year. They might not. But it only takes one government, perhaps for domestic political reasons of its own, to say no, and that brings the whole process to a crashing halt. That's why, although, despite what I have said earlier in this committee session about the, in my judgment, very severe costs of a no-deal exit, I've always been in favour of preparing for no deal as a contingency option, because this is not a decision that is entirely in the gift of the government of the United Kingdom.
you've suggested to us that there might be some renegotiation of the political declaration, or perhaps some additional protocol might be negotiated. And you think one or both of those might be possible before the 31st of October?
Well, you can always negotiate something to take effect after a particular deadline. I mean, I think that any such changes, if there were the political will and political agreement that a further set of changes was satisfactory to both the EU and UK and would provide a parliamentary majority at Westminster, then I could see that it might need a technical extension to take legislation through, but I could see how that could be done with new documents deposited on the 1st of October. First of November. Let us say. It is a very short timescale the new government will have.
And on that, I mean, we've then got we've got a summer break between now and so is that a significant? I mean, is that a significant impediment to negotiating?
Oh, it's a problem because both in member state governments and in the institutions, awful lot of people will have booked their family holidays for the July-August period. But to be honest, I think that if there is a sense that this is serious, that people will make sacrifices to try and get a deal done.
And how much of a difficulty is it that the new Commission wouldn't take up its role until the day after the 31st of October? I mean, it seems a little bit. It would be surely difficult for the outgoing Commission to negotiate a change to the political declaration or a new protocol just a few days before the new Commission takes over.
I think that I don't actually myself think that the Commission is a major obstacle here. The Commission is never dissolved. Of course, the Juncker Commission continues, if necessary, in a caretaker capacity until a new President and College have been confirmed by the European Parliament. So even if there were a logjam in Strasbourg and the Commission, the new Commission, were not in place in this calendar year, the Juncker Commission, there would be people. The Juncker Commission would be in office, still and able to take decisions. Yes. The key element, and actually, a new Commission might well welcome inheriting a situation in which the UK problem had actually been sorted out by their predecessors, so they could get on with other things. The key issue is the European Parliament, because the European Parliament, that means the new European Parliament's assent with a majority, with an overall majority of the entire membership of the European Parliament, is necessary under Article 50 for any withdrawal agreement to take effect. So I would expect that if any talks take place under President Juncker's stewardship of the Commission, he will probably have lines open to Ursula von der Leyen, and he will also be wanting to keep in very close contact with the main group leaders and committee chairs in the European Parliament, because actually making sure that they are on board is going to be essential.
So, sorry, one more? I mean, just all of that considered, how likely is it that there's going to be a proposition for a deal on the table by the 31st of October that's any different from what's there at the moment?
I think that my own view is that if there is a deal to be done, I think a lot of it is going to resemble the deal that is on the table. The key question is whether there are changes which can be negotiated in a way that both sides are willing to accept, which the European Parliament is prepared to endorse, and which will command a safe majority at Westminster. That will be the test for the new PM.
Thank you. Richard Graham.
Thank you, Chairman. And Minister, welcome. On that point, it's a good moment to pick up what happened before the third time the Withdrawal Agreement Bill was presented to Parliament, because there were, of course, changes made to the Withdrawal Agreement in shape of the additional protocol, which dealt with the backstop issue. At that time, many of us here voted for it on the basis that the additional reassurances given on the method of arbitration to leave the customs union if we wished to was adequate. Was your sense after the vote that actually the arrangements were not adequate, or that they were inadequately sold, particularly to the DUP, or that Europe could have done more to give us reassurance that we could have unilaterally been able to get out of it if possible?
No, my sense was slightly different. My sense was that that those members of Parliament who voted against the deal the third time around were making a mistaken judgment about national interest, because it seemed to me that, first of all, that much of the argument was not about the terms of the withdrawal agreement, but it was about the terms of the future relationship, which was something still to be settled in negotiation and in parliamentary debates in the years to come. And secondly, that many of the issues, for example, confirmatory vote, which motivated some people to vote down the withdrawal agreement the third time round, were things that would have come up in any case during the passage of legislation on a withdrawal implementation bill. So I felt that that the opponents of the bill had made the wrong judgment, made the opponents of the vote of the resolution that the government put down were making a wrong judgment there. I mean, one can always, the historians will look back and sort of make a judgment about, who made the right call or wrong call in the negotiations at some stage in the last 3 years. I think that...
but can I interrupt, Minister? In specific, of course, some people were strongly put off by the last line of the attorney's letter, which said, in effect, that nothing legally had changed. And that was surely a consideration for the DUP members in particular.
I think that was. Of course, the earlier in the attorney's letter, he had said that the chances, the balance of legal risk, and I think the phrase was significantly altered for the better. So I think it was partly a matter of what people were wanting to read into the attorney's letter. And I would go back to what I said earlier about the backstop. I mean, what you go around talking to ministers in France or Germany or the Netherlands, and they'll say, this is mad. You are getting, O United Kingdom, tariff-free, quota-free, rules of origin-free access to our single market, and you're not accepting freedom of movement, and you're not paying into the budget, and you are not accepting all the level playing field obligations that member states have to do. This is Barnier has sold us short. If you think that we actually want this backstop, or if it comes in to last any length of time, you must be mad. And so, it is one of the remarkable features of the outcome negotiation that the views of the backstop in the United Kingdom, the views of the backstop in the European Union, are completely different in how people read it.
But nonetheless, that's the area, in terms of the additional protocol, where there could be wiggle room for a future leader to explore.
I mean, it could be, but I think I go back to what I don't want to do is rouse false hopes in the committee. I mean, I would hope that something could be looked at again. I just think that a no deal would be so bad. A no deal would be bad for everybody, particularly for the UK and Ireland. But you come back to this point that Task Force 50 returned to again and again in negotiations, that it isn't just about north-south on the island of Ireland, it is about an external border of the single market of the European Union. And they were asking, the TF50 were asking questions, well, how can you ensure that there won't be American or Turkish or Indian manufacturers or foodstuffs imported into Northern Ireland, and it comes anywhere in our single market, and it's suddenly a highway for large-scale smuggling.
Indeed. Of course, there's been talk from one of the candidates for the Conservative leadership that after a no-deal exit from the European Union, GATT 24 could be agreed between the UK and the EU. How realistic, in your view, is that?
I think it's a complete misreading of Article 24, and I think Mr. Azevedo, the Secretary-General of the WTO, said as much as earlier this week. Article 24 is not about interim arrangements. It is about all customs union or free trade agreements between any WTO member and any other country or group of countries.
How realistic might it be in a no-deal exit for the citizens' rights elements of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill to be separated out from the financial obligations of Northern Ireland in order to ensure that the 3 million here and the 1.2 million there, that their lives weren't too disrupted?
Legally, you could do it as long as you did it while the United Kingdom was still a member state of the European Union. You cannot so readily do it after exit, because if we exit without the transitional arrangements, then the legal position is that it becomes a member state rather than an EU competence to negotiate citizens' rights agreements with third countries.
Yeah.
So it becomes much more difficult if we leave without deal and then try to sort citizens' rights out. I think politically, I don't see that it really gains anything to try to separate these things, because the EU is not going to agree to even start free trade agreement negotiations for the longer term unless all three of those critical issues, citizens' rights, financial settlement and the Irish border, have been satisfactorily resolved.
You said earlier that from an EU perspective it would be incredibly important for them to know, if they were to make any additional concessions, that a new leader could actually take the legislation successfully through Parliament. How important in that process will be the views of the 26 Labour MPs who wrote to their leader expressing concern about the Labour Party's change of policy on leaving the European Union?
It would be important, but I think that, so far as I can tell, I think what EU governments will be looking for is more than letters, that they would actually be looking for evidence that people will vote in a way that commands a majority in the House.
And in the event of no deal, was what you were saying earlier effectively indicating that there would have to be home rule on day one in Northern Ireland?
Direct rule. Direct rule in day one. Yes. I mean, I think that if you talk to the Chief Constable of the PSNI about the potential risks to public order, and you're looking at a situation in which there would be no devolved Justice Minister to take decisions. If you're looking just about possible problems over transport across the border, but no devolved transport minister in place, you have to have somebody, and in my view somebody who's democratically accountable, who has the authority to take those decisions from day one.
And in the event of direct rule, how serious would be the likelihood of violence of some sort and possibly
I think
physical harm?
The recently retired Chief Constable of the PSNI, Sir George Hamilton, has said publicly that he is very concerned about the risks of public disorder. There is no doubt in my mind that both dissident Republican terrorists and organised crime would look for ways in which to exploit the situation to their own advantage. But it seems to me that those, I don't want to exaggerate the threats, because organisations like the dissident Republicans will look for ways to cause havoc in whatever circumstances, but they would latch on to this as one way of doing that. But I certainly think that the risk of public disorder would be greater, and that was certainly the view of the PSNI when I talked to them about this.
And lastly, Chairman, if I might, very briefly, last question.
Very briefly.
In terms of what might happen on the 31st of October, clearly one leadership candidate has said, we will leave on the 31st of October at the latest, and the other has allowed for some wiggle room in terms of if there was a possibility of a deal on the table and time needed for the legislation and so on. Is your understanding clear that the EU would extend the current expiry date if there were clear reasons to extend it in order to allow for legislation to be passed?
I mean, that is my reading of the public statements that have been made so far. As I said earlier, I think that there is greater reluctance now than a year or 6 months ago to go for an extension, particularly if it is just to give more thinking time and more debating time. But if it was for a particular purpose, then I think that the case is one that they would accept. And certainly from the EU point of view, they have said publicly that they would be prepared to consider a further extension, either if there were an agreement in sight and you needed some extra weeks technically to get relevant agreements and legislation through, or if there were a democratic event of some kind in the United Kingdom. That they've said, this is not a secret, they've said this publicly.
Right, now, fortunately, we've run out of time. On behalf of the committee, can I thank you very much indeed for coming today, for giving evidence that's been extremely informative and interesting and may well figure in some of our subsequent reports.
Thank you very much indeed.
And then if we could seamlessly change places and invite Keir Starmer to come and take a seat. So Keir, of course, the Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Can I thank you too for agreeing to come and appear before the committee this afternoon? We really do appreciate it. As you can guess from the previous session, we've got a lot of questions to ask and ground to cover. Can I begin with the first question I put to David Lidington? During the course of the cross-party talks, did you feel that the government had moved on any of its red lines?
I think both we and the government were exploring our positions and seeing whether we could bridge gaps between us. And actually what we didn't do on both sides was to set out our red lines at the beginning of the process, because we didn't think that was particularly helpful for each side to say, these are our red lines, these are your red lines, because we didn't think we'd get anywhere. So what we did was to explore the issues and see whether we could bridge in any of the areas. The areas, broadly speaking, was there anything on the substance we could agree? And that was things like single market, customs union, workplace rights, etc. Then the lock, and that took more time than probably everything else, which was that by the time the talks started, the Prime Minister had indicated she was stepping down. And therefore, a central concern of ours was, even if somehow we were to reach an agreement with David Lidington and his team, would that be able to survive more than a few weeks? We were particularly concerned about that because during the talks, and whilst we were in the room talking, members of the Cabinet and or those that were later to throw their hat in the ring to be leaders were generally making statements about how they wouldn't respect the outcome of the process, so it became a real issue. And then the other issue that I was very focused on from the start was deliverability, which was, would there be the numbers to actually carry this through? Because I took the view that unless we could build a sustainable majority that would stick with an agreement, not only to vote a deal through, subject to a lock and subject to issues such as a second referendum, but would that majority be in place for the legislation that had to follow from that? And because we were invited into the talks so late, and that was a big mistake in my view, there were difficult issues. The withdrawal agreement, for example, it was assumed could not be reopened. And there were issues in the withdrawal agreement that we had to therefore find workarounds for. And there was a big discussion about changing the political declaration. And so at one point, we were discussing with the government changes to the political declaration, the terms of the implementing legislation, the terms of the agriculture bill, the terms of the environmental bill, and the terms of a workers' rights bill, because all of the issues between us came up into all of those bills. And so the question of sustainable majority was not, can you get something over a line on one evening in the House of Commons? It was essentially, could you get a working and sustainable majority that would carry through a whole series of pieces of legislation if this was to work? And so that was the basis on which we were exploring how far we could go.
On the question of the customs union, and you'll have heard what David Lidington said in answer to my question, did you feel that the offer of some kind of arrangement up till the next general election really constituted something, given that if the transition were to run its full term, we'd be in one anyway for another 8 months?
I didn't think that was a substantive offer, and I thought it was problematic. It wasn't a substantive offer because I think that if there is a transition period, we'll be in transition until the next election in any event, and therefore simply saying that there'll be a customs arrangement until the next general election was really to say, well, the transition can extend to the next general election. But there were two other problems which we explored and which were real, because what the government wanted was to say that during the period up to the general election, they would negotiate their preferred position, so that the temporary arrangement would be a holding position, but they would use the months or years to the general election to negotiate with the with the EU, their preferred position, which was outside a customs union with an independent trade policy. Well, fine and understandable from their point of view, but from the Labour Party point of view, to sort of win an election and go to the EU and say, can you forget the 3 years of negotiation you've just done and the agreement you've just almost reached, and start again, seemed to us problematic. The other was that, assuming for a moment there wasn't a transition period, and that this was going to be part of an agreement, it introduced the suggestion, which we discussed, that you'd have a transition, you'd then go to an agreement which had an unresolved element, namely the customs union, and the idea of then a further agreement some way further down the line. So you sort of had transition and then an interim agreement of some sort, where most things were agreed with the EU but not the customs arrangement. I couldn't really see how that would work. We said we're still parking the customs arrangement and we'll come back to that in a few years for a further agreement down the line. I didn't think that would work in practice, and one of the main issues between us was that I was very clear that we needed to see changes to the political declaration before we could sign anything off. In other words, we couldn't agree simply the government would use its best endeavours to seek changes. We need to know, because I wanted to know the answer to the question, would the EU actually agree to this sort of interim agreement that wasn't really the final agreement that would come sometime after the general election? So that became a central issue. And in the end, that's why it wasn't really either a substantive offer, because it was no different to transition, and it wasn't really practical or workable and had never been explored with the EU in any event, and therefore it didn't really survive much scrutiny.
And clearly the people with whom you were negotiating, given what you said a moment ago, could not have offered you any guarantee or assurance, so whatever you did negotiate and maybe reach agreement on would be proof against being changed by an incoming Prime Minister.
No, they couldn't. No, and I was, at the minimum, we needed changes to the political declaration, real changes. Not that we'd try and get changes, real changes. And in the early weeks, one of the sticking points in the talks was whether the government were actually prepared to even seek changes to the political declaration. And there was an exchange between myself and David then said, we are prepared to seek changes to the political declaration. But it was only in weeks 3 or 4 that the government actually instructed Ollie Robbins to contact the EU to see whether they'd be open to changes and ask the question, how long would that take? So we were well into the 6 weeks before the government actually reached out to Brussels to say, is there a possibility of changes? When they did so, they've given an answer that reasonably simple changes would take 4 to 6 weeks, more complicated changes longer than that. And that presented the government with a central problem, which was it became obvious that they couldn't get any changes to the political declaration in time to start the implementing legislation, and hence we went to this, I think, odd situation of moving to the implementing legislation for a bill which hadn't been agreed. So this idea of implementing a deal, notwithstanding, we didn't know what the deal actually had in it. And I thought that was putting the cart before the horse. I think it's a fundamental problem.
Did you get an impression during the negotiations that the government appreciated the economic impact on the UK of no deal, which we've been taking further evidence on in the last 4 weeks?
Yes. We had different ministers around the table, so they took different takes on this, but I was dealing mainly with David Lidington, and I think he had a very good understanding of what the impact of no deal was, and was doing everything in the talks to try to avoid that outcome. But we did get to this stage, as I say, where in the end the suggestion was to start the implementing legislation without the deal, and among the problems with that is that you can bet your bottom dollar that any amendments to the bill, absent knowledge of what the deal is, are not going to work, because the deal comes along at the end of the exercise, you realise you've pressed the wrong amendments and you'd have put a different series of amendments had you known what the deal was. And more substantially, and I said this to David, I didn't want to start a bill that would take weeks of the extension without knowing that the deal at the end was going to be acceptable, because if the deal wasn't acceptable, it would crash the whole process and we would have wasted months and used up all the available time.
Okay. Just again, a one-word answer. Do you think it would be acceptable to prorogue Parliament, to stop Parliament expressing its view about a possible no-deal Brexit in October?
Completely unacceptable. I'd hope it would be challenged if it was done.
Okay. And is it your view that if the House of Commons were to vote once again to say we don't accept a no-deal Brexit, that any Prime Minister should respect that?
I think Prime Minister should respect that. Yes.
Okay. If no deal were to happen, and we enter this period of shock, as we heard from David Lidington a moment ago, and uncertainty, unless that were to continue indefinitely, at some point, it's reasonable to assume that one side would pick up the phone to the other and say, how are we going to sort out the difficulties that we're in? Where do you think the UK might end up in the form of some temporary holding pattern while some kind of future relationship were negotiated to sort out the difficulty that had been created?
Well, I've always had a difficulty with the argument that you could leave without a deal and once outside negotiate a deal that's better than the deal you could have negotiated whilst you were on the inside. So unless we're contemplating leaving without a deal and never having an arrangement with the EU ever again, I'm assuming that there are therefore talks at some stage after we've left without a deal, and the EU's position, I'm pretty sure, would be, well, you better settle your debts, you better sort out the position for EU citizens, and we will need assurances about the Irish border, and then we can talk to you about a deal. So you're in precisely the same position you're in now, but you've left the EU and you're in a weaker bargaining position. So I've never understood the logic of saying you leave without a deal in order to get a better deal. That seems to me you leave without a deal, get complete chaos, and end up with an inferior deal if you get anything at all.
But specifically on the point of where we might sit temporarily, assuming there was a will to sort it out, can you see what kind of arrangement that would be, given that in the absence of that, would we a third country with all of the consequences that flow from a no-deal Brexit?
Well, I don't know, but I can't at the moment see how the EU would insist on less in relation to a third party than they are insisting on for a departing friendly member. But I mean, I would also just add this, because on the government, as you know, last summer published technical notices on what would be needed for no deal. And there's obviously work going on in the Cabinet about how prepared they are for no deal. The technical notices indicate that there are various bits of legislation that need to be passed if no deal is to be done without complete chaos, that a number of international agreements need to be changed if we're not to leave without total chaos. And the last report, as I understand it, to the Cabinet said we're behind schedule. So even when we get to no deal, there are two types of no deal. One is a no deal that after you've completed all the necessary steps insofar as the government has set them out, which is not going to happen by the 31st of October, or you leave with no deal knowing you haven't even completed the bare minimum that the government itself says is necessary for a no deal. So there's chaotic and there's very chaotic.
And do I take it finally from what you've just said that in order to try and bring to an end the uncertainty and the shock that we heard about earlier, that your judgment is that the UK would have to accept the obligations of the withdrawal agreement, even though it had left without a deal on the 31st of October for the purpose of avoiding having to accept them?
Yes.
Right.
I can't see why the EU would say, well, now you've left without a deal, you don't have to pay what we think are your financial dues. Now you've left without a deal, you don't have to make arrangements for EU citizens. Or now you've left, we don't have to make an arrangement for Northern Ireland. I can't see the circumstance in which they say that, or why they would do it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Stephen Kelly.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Keir, very much. You've said many times, and I think many of us around this table share the view that crashing out of the European Union on the 30th... No, I said many. I said many. Sorry, I've lost my chain now. Because
No.
Yeah, sorry, you keep interrupting. It's quite hard to keep the train of thought when you keep heckling from the sideline. Yeah.
Peter. Sorry.
Steve. That's not a term you should use in a select committee.
Now, Steve.
You shouldn't say you know that, Jeff.
I would argue that it's a very well-established term to describe leaving without a deal.
Just to draw this little exchange to a close, and apologies to the witness, members are entitled to put the questions they want in the terms in which they want, and if we were all to interject because we object to the terms in which the question is put, our sessions will be even longer than they are already. I suggest we allow each member to ask their question, respect their ability to do so. The floor is with Stephen Kelly now.
Thank you, Chair. That the implications for our economy and for our national security and for the Good Friday Agreement would be very concerning indeed. Would you agree that we are now much closer to that scenario than we have ever been?
No. I think that for some time there's been a majority in Parliament that's against no deal. I think it's spoken on a number of occasions, and it drove the initiative in March and April to not only seize the order paper but also to pass primary legislation requiring the Prime Minister to extend Article 50, which was a very effective way of preventing no deal. In the end, by the time the legislation was passed, the Prime Minister already decided to extend Article 50, so it didn't have the effect that it might otherwise have had, but otherwise it would have been a very effective instrument in stopping the Prime Minister from doing so. My sense is that that majority is still there, and I think that, and I hope, that in 2 weeks some of those currently in the Cabinet may feel, if they're not in the Cabinet, I think they won't be, that they would join with those that want to take action to prevent no deal. So I think the numbers may change in the next couple of weeks.
But on the other hand, the future of the country, or the government at least, is now in the hands of 160,000 Conservative Party members, the majority of whom appear to embrace the idea of leaving without a deal, and the Prime Minister, the candidate who looks highly likely to win, has said we will leave on the 31st of October come hell or high water, and the legal default position under European law, under the terms of Article 50 of course, is that there's no alternative on the table, we leave without a deal. Do you not feel that that's stacking up towards massively increasing the likelihood of leaving without a deal on the 31st of October?
It certainly increased the risk. The legal default's been the same since Article 50 was triggered, so that hasn't changed. It was the legal default on March the 29th, it's the legal default on October 31st, so that's neutral as to who the Prime Minister is. The current Prime Minister for many months said it's my deal or no deal. If you don't vote through my deal, we're going to crash out without a deal. That was the way she put it. I accept that an incoming Prime Minister might ramp that up, but that's where the political fight is with Parliament as to where the numbers are on preventing no deal. But the risks have gone up.
The risk has gone up, yes. Just looking at the sort of sequencing of events between the collapse of the cross-party talks and the publication of the withdrawal agreement bill, were you surprised? Was there anything in the withdrawal agreement bill that hadn't been discussed in the cross-party talks?
I don't think the bill was ever published. Well, I think what the Prime Minister did was to indicate some of the features that might be in the bill.
Yes, so there was a list of 10 points. Which, sorry.
There was, but I think I'm right in saying it was never published. And one of the issues that we had to grapple with in the talks was that we would sometimes try to explore a position, let's say on customs, in ordinary language, and then ask the government to look at what that would actually look like in a bill. And suddenly what you thought you'd been exploring didn't quite match up with what's in the bill. That's not critical of anyone, it's just that there's often a gap between what people say they're trying to achieve and what is actually written in a bill. So I don't think the bill was there. But I think some of the things we've been discussed were certainly identified by the Prime Minister when she unveiled what she said was going to be in the bill. What happened next vindicated one of my central concerns. Because on, I think it was March the 14th, so a couple of weeks before we started the cross-party talks, the Prime Minister had had a vote on the extension of Article 50. And on her own side, only 112 of her MPs had followed her whip, and 188 had broken the whip. And throughout the talks, one of my central concerns, and I kept challenging the other side, it was a friendly challenge, it wasn't an aggressive in any way, was have you got the you're putting these proposals on the table, have you got the numbers on your side to carry this off? And I was really worried that they never really had the numbers. And of course, the Prime Minister announced some of the features of the implementing legislation at the beginning of the week, and I think by the Friday she had been forced to say she was leaving as Prime Minister. And if ever there was evidence that our judgment call was right, that she couldn't in fact deliver, and this is not critical of her, they're just the numbers, that was it, because she showcased some of what we've been discussing and not all of it, and her own party decided that was enough for them to require her to leave as Prime Minister. And I have no doubt that the same would have happened if we'd been standing alongside her. I just didn't. That deliverability was a massive problem, and I always had in my mind that the fact that 188 of her own side defied a three-line whip on simple extension, not particularly controversial, and a lot less controversial than some of the positions in the implementing legislation, and I couldn't see how the numbers were ever going to stack up.
If you, just sort of a hypothetical question, if, for example, the second referendum option and the revoke option were simply not on the table, and you had to choose between what was announced, you're right, not published, but what was announced, if you like, presented by the government as what would be the key features of a withdrawal agreement bill, and you had to choose between that WAB and crashing out without a deal, presumably you would choose the WAB over leaving the EU without a deal.
Well, obviously that's not the circumstance.
No.
There are other options, and therefore that's never been a choice we've been presented with. But yes, of course, leaving without a deal is better than leaving with a deal is better than leaving without a deal. But one has to be careful how far you take that, because the current Prime Minister's approach was obviously not to bring Parliament into the process during any point of the negotiations. And that, even the call to us to have cross-party talks was after the 29th of March. It wasn't 11th hour, it was after midnight. And therefore, there was no consensus about what a deal might look like, no attempt to build that majority. And if the simple proposition is leaving with any deal is better than leaving with no deal, then that would require all of us to sign up to any deal, even if it's a Canada minus deal, because it got the word deal written at the top of it. In other words, it takes the whole critical role of MPs out of it altogether, because you simply say, well, as long as you've got something that's got deal written at the top and it's signed by the 27 and us, we'll have to vote for it in the end. I mean, it seemed to me that removed any effective scrutiny or challenge in Parliament.
Some have characterised the decision not to back the withdrawal agreement bill as allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Would you agree with that characterisation?
I think the political reality is that the implementing bill fell because within days of announcing it, the Prime Minister was taken out.
Do you think the timing was problematic? Because, of course, it was done just a few days before the European Parliament elections. Perhaps all parties were at their most partisan at that time.
Well, possibly, but the idea that the Prime Minister would bring just a few votes to the table and the Labour Party would provide the bulk of the votes and this would be a happy arrangement that would leave her in post, I didn't think was realistic. In other words, the first test of the implementation legislation was, have you got your own side on board? If so, what then can the Labour Party add? And the Prime Minister didn't have her own side on board because she announced some of what we'd been discussing, and the reaction of her own party was to say, we no longer want you as our Prime Minister. And therefore she hadn't got over the first hurdle of ensuring that she got enough on her own banks to begin a meaningful discussion with us about the passage of the bill. So, we said we wouldn't support it, but frankly, whatever we'd said, her own side had already formed a judgment on that pretty swiftly, and within a week she was, had resigned as Prime Minister.
One final question. I asked Mr. Lidington earlier if he'd be comfortable with sharing the documents with the committee in terms of documents provided by the government to the Labour side, and I just wondered if we could ask the same question, if there are documents that were provided to the government in response to their proposals by...
Well, I heard what David said, and I think the sensible thing is for David and I to talk about it, and I obviously need to check on my side as to what our approach would be. He obviously wants to check with the other ministers and refresh and remind ourselves what the documents are. That seems a sensible course of action.
Many thanks. Thank you, Chair.
So, did you vote to trigger Article 50?
Yep.
And did you vote to extend Article 50 to the 31st of October?
Yes.
And do you recognise that under Article 50 there are two ways of leaving the European Union, either with a deal or without a deal? There's no third way of leaving the European Union.
Yes.
And that as a lawyer yourself, you must have been involved in negotiations in and outside court, in which you and your clients must have made the threat that if a deal is not done, then you will walk away. You recall that from your practice as a member of the bar?
Well, walk away or not walk away. Normally it'd be go into court and fight, but yes, I get the point.
Yes. So you seem to be suggesting now that the United Kingdom should concede to the European Union that in no circumstances would they walk away from a deal. Therefore, the United Kingdom must accept a deal, and in so doing, you are effectively giving the European Union a veto over the contents of that deal by refusing to contemplate walking away.
No, I think that no deal would be an act of economic and national self-harm that far outweighs the tactics in the negotiating exercise. And I think if you're going to make a threat in negotiations, it's got to be credible. In my negotiations in and around court proceedings, if you made a threat which both sides knew you'd never carry out, it didn't really have much force.
Well, that is the point, isn't it? Because Her Majesty's official opposition is trying to undermine the credibility of walking away without a deal, that is giving credence to the European Union that they think that they can impose terms on us rather as though we are the vanquished following a conflict rather than wanting to be able to exercise our freedom. This is not imposing terms like Treaty of Versailles on the vanquished. This is a free country wanting to exercise its right to change its arrangements with the European Union.
The way I saw it was this, that under Article 50, if you haven't reached an agreement by the deadline, you're pushed over a cliff. To threaten to jump early didn't seem to me to be a particularly credible threat.
So when you voted for triggering Article 50, you recognised, put it in your terms, you saw it as if you didn't get a deal before the 29th of March, then you would be pushed over a cliff. So you recognised that as a clear possibility. That was the implication of supporting Article 50, wasn't it?
Well, what the Labour Party said very clearly at the time, and in our manifesto of 2017, is we, under no circumstances will we accept no deal. So we have always maintained the position that leaving without a deal is not a viable option as far as the Labour Party is concerned.
But as far as the British people are concerned, the leaving without a deal is far more popular than leaving with the Prime Minister's deal. You accept that?
No, but let's just explore what we mean by no deal, because I think we talk about slightly different things. If we are literally leaving without any agreement at all between ourselves and the European Union, we are rupturing our trading arrangements overnight, both the customs union and the single market. And I have talked to businesses across the United Kingdom, and all of them have said to me that would be extremely damaging for them. But we would also not have any arrangements on anything else. I was the UK representative in Eurojust when I was the Director of Public Prosecutions. That's a European agency that we would crash out of with no deal. It's an agency where we share intelligence, high-grade intelligence, on very serious criminality, normally terrorism and human trafficking. And that's going on 24/7. And what we do is we track the criminal activity, and we agree jointly when we're going to intervene, arrest, and then how we're going to prosecute those cases. It's a small example, but if we were to leave without a deal, we would come out of those arrangements. Now, just bear me out. There are some areas where you could say we could probably live without a deal for a short period of time, but in my experience dealing with very serious terrorism cases, any gap in the coverage is a huge risk, and I would never take that risk with our country.
I think you're right to refuse to equate leaving without a deal with leaving without a withdrawal agreement. What we're talking about when we're talking about leaving, when I'm talking about leaving without a deal, I'm talking about leaving without a withdrawal agreement. So we can leave without a withdrawal agreement, but also leave with other deals to cover the sort of situations which you've been describing, and that's well documented, and it seems to be is part of the agenda that the prospective prime ministers are thinking about.
The problem is it's not well documented and it's not possible. If you leave without a withdrawal agreement, you have got no agreement. If we want side agreements, we better get on with negotiating them. Well, because we haven't got any at the moment, and October 31st isn't very far away. There are no side agreements. If we go without a withdrawal agreement, we have no agreement on anything with the EU. That covers trade, it covers aviation, it covers climate change, and it covers security and counter-terrorism. And because I spent 5 years working on security and counter-terrorism, and because I know the intelligence that's being worked on and the prosecutions that are being worked on, I think leaving without any deal would be extremely bad for our country and make our citizens very unsafe.
So you're basically...
But the idea of we're leaving without a deal, but we might have deals on the side...
So you're pleading with the government to start working on some side deals, which I agree with you is a very sensible way forward.
I'm trying to explore what you mean. When I say no deal would be very dangerous for the following reasons, you say to me, well, no deal isn't really no deal because there'll be deals on the side. My point is there aren't any. there are no negotiated deals on the side. There isn't a security and counter-terrorism deal on the side. If you pull out of the arrangements, you've pulled out of the arrangements, and there's nothing in place. And that is a very dangerous place to be. And I'll tell you this, if any Prime Minister or Home Secretary allows that to happen, and there is then a terrorist incident that could have been prevented, the public will never forgive them. And the idea that the public would applaud this, and it can, I'm sure you've been to Eurojust, but if you haven't, go and have a look at the types of cases they're working on, because I've seen them firsthand and been involved in them. They are very serious terrorist gangs operating usually in 3, 4 or 5 countries, and they are sometimes advanced in their planning. And if there was an attack during the period in which we were out without a deal, no Prime Minister would survive that, nor should he or she.
Okay. Leaving aside your hysterical fear-mongering, if the government accepts that the withdrawal agreement that there is there at the moment is not a goer, it's never going to get through Parliament, then your advice to the government is to start working on these side deals to cover the sort of scenario you've been talking about. Is that a way of summarising what you're saying?
No, I'm meeting your response to me saying leaving without a deal would leave huge gaps, is that the proposal would be there are all sorts of side deals. I'm saying in response to that, those side deals haven't been negotiated, the discussions haven't been begun, neither the UK nor the EU has even explored them. In the time that is available between now and October the 31st, I think it's extremely unlikely that they're going to be in place, ratified and up and running.
But you'd like work to start on that in the next so during the next 3 months, work can be done on that.
No, I would like us to take no deal off the table, so we don't have to waste our time on something which would be very damaging for our country.
So you'd like to take no deal off the table and basically give a veto to the European Union on the terms of the withdrawal agreement. I can understand your point of view. I disagree with it. But can I ask you this? What do you think the implications will be for the British Constitution if Parliament refuses to deliver the referendum result for which the people voted, in other words, to leave the European Union? They didn't vote to leave the European Union with a deal, they voted to leave the European Union. We've already delayed that. If we go beyond the 31st of October, won't there be a constitutional crisis of immense proportions?
Well, unfortunately, lots of things were said in the referendum campaign that shouldn't have been said. But the proposal that a vote to leave is a vote to leave with no deal was not one that was put on the table. Lots of things were said, such as you can leave and get £350 million for the NHS, which I don't believe to be true. You can leave, and the EU is so dependent upon us for trade, they'll give us any terms we ask for. And we can leave, and we will get better trade agreements around the world with many countries who will treat us as a preferred customer. None of that is going to come to fruition in my view, but I don't think you could say that people voted leave in order to get no deal.
Perhaps not. They were hoping for a deal, but they were recognising that if the only deal on offer by the EU was a bad deal, to use the Prime Minister's words from Lancaster House, if they would recognise if the only deal was a bad deal, leaving without a deal under the terms of Article 50 would be far preferable and the only way of meeting the commitment of the referendum.
Well, one of the things I've tried to do since I've been in this role is to get around the United Kingdom and go in particular to areas that voted to leave, to have discussions with communities, with groups, with businesses, etc., to make sure I'm as informed as I can be. My strong impression from those discussions, involving now many thousands of people, is that the idea that all Remain voters voted as a sort of groupthink for something, and that all Leave voters voted as a sort of groupthink for something else, is completely wrong. People who've spoken to me who voted Leave say they voted for all sorts of different reasons with different strengths of feeling, and I respect the fact that they did that, but the idea that we can badge millions of voters and say they all voted for X, we know that, is not borne out by any of my experiences going around the United Kingdom, and I do it every week. And as I say, in particular go to Leave areas because I think it's very important I do so. Okay, and I simply haven't come up against this groupthink block.
Okay, can I just ask you this? You've described the traditional parties in your support. What about the BrExit party? The BrExit party has got immense support across the country, and that is coming from people who are in the category I've been describing, people who voted to leave the European Union and want us to leave no later than the 31st of October. Preferably with an agreement, but if we can't get a decent agreement, then we must leave in any event. Do you respect that enormous group of people in this country, and would you accept that if you don't respect them, then you will be betraying their interests and creating a constitutional crisis?
Of course I respect them. I've tried throughout my period in the post I'm in to respect all sides of the argument, and in particular people who voted both ways, and very many MPs who have strong views differently on Brexit. Of course I try to respect that, but at the end of the day I think we have a duty to act in the national interest and take a judgment call as a parliament as to what's in the national interest. In my view, it would be contrary to the national interest to leave without a deal, for the reasons I've set out, and I think that's a view shared by the majority in Parliament.
Okay, Peter Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Can I follow up on that point? First of all, Sir Keir, before we move on to the questions at hand, and thank you for coming in to speak to us today. The only time the Brexit Party have stood in elections, they got 6 million votes. 17 million people voted to leave the European Union. Do you have any idea where the other 11 million Leave voters have gone, and why they maybe didn't vote for the only party that's promoting a no-deal Brexit?
No, but the turnout was obviously low in the EU elections.
Right. But it is the case, isn't it, that in the referendum people weren't given the chance to vote for a no-deal Brexit, they were given a chance to vote for a Brexit. In the European elections they were given the chance to vote for a party that said unequivocally no-deal Brexit, and well over half, in fact almost two-thirds of Leave voters didn't take the chance to vote for a no-deal Brexit when it was put in front of them.
Yeah, well, I agree with that, and I what was on offer to Leave voters, it varied according to who was speaking, but what was proposed was not no deal. What was proposed was deal. Claims were made that we could have the single market, the customs union, and the rest to boot.
Thank you. In answer to, I can't remember if it was Stephen or one of the Stephens earlier, you confirmed that effectively once Article 50, so triggering legislation, was passed, then no deal became the default unless something else happened. Given that you voted for the second reading, you then voted for the third reading, by which point we know that there were going to be no strings or conditions or anything else attached to it. What did you think would happen between your vote helping to trigger Article 50 unconditionally and the date of leaving the European Union? What did you think would happen to prevent a no-deal Brexit from taking place?
The Parliament would do what it could to seize control of the agenda, and that's why I worked up the idea of a meaningful vote. The phrase meaningful vote started with me, and I talked to other people about it. I worked with colleagues across the Chamber on it, including agreeing how amendments would be put in order to secure a meaningful vote and therefore a real foothold for Parliament to be able to evaluate what came back and say no if the deal wasn't good enough. So what I wanted to put in place was a check, safety valve. We did that. Dominic Grieve obviously pushed the amendment back in December of 2017, and we got the meaningful vote enshrined in legislation.
But at the time that you voted unconditionally to trigger Article 50, the Prime Minister had an overall majority of MPs. Wasn't it at best a bit optimistic and possibly even almost reckless to trust either to a majority Conservative government or to parliamentary procedures which had seldom, in some cases, never been put to the test before, to protect us from what you're now saying, and which I agree would be the worst possible kind of Brexit? Do you any time wonder whether you made a huge mistake by voting for Article 50 when you did?
No, I don't see it in that way, and the fact of the matter is we did win the right to a meaningful vote. We got that enshrined in legislation, and it gives us not only the meaningful vote but also the ability to take further measures, as you saw in March, April, consequent upon the vote going down. So I actually think that collectively, and Labour Party played its part, but so did other parties and so did other MPs, we put in a very effective lock on the system. But for that, the Prime Minister was proposing simply to come and announce the deal that she had made. But because of that initiative, we have the ability to stop that. And that's where we are, and I think that's a good place to be.
Is it the case that as of today we have about 20 to 25 parliamentary sitting days left, and that if the new Prime Minister decides to go for no deal, there isn't anything constitutional that we can do without the support of members of the Conservative Party? That's the case, isn't it? We have to rely on support across the House, including those who were voted on a manifesto of supporting Brexit, to prevent us from a no-deal Brexit.
Yes, that's how we won the meaningful vote. That's how we won any of the votes that we've won in the last 3 years.
How meaningful was the meaningful vote if we won the meaningful vote and we're still heading for a no-deal Brexit at the end of October?
Well, it's pretty meaningful because but for that we'd have left. So 3 times the deal was voted down. So if the test of effectiveness is did it stop a deal that shouldn't have gone through, then it scores pretty high.
Is it the intention of the official opposition, and I'm not asking you to give away secrets as to how you might achieve it, is it your intention that there will be a Labour government in the United Kingdom before the 31st of October?
Look, we want a Labour government as soon as possible.
Okay, do you have your own version of the withdrawal agreement and political declaration ready to take to Europe in the event that you become the government?
Our own version of the withdrawal agreement and political declaration? No, of course we don't. But what we have been doing, as I think it's not a secret, is having discussions with Michel Barnier and his Article 50 team for the best part of a couple of years now to discuss and explore what the possibilities would be for any negotiations that we might have and the state of negotiations as they are. And that's been going on for some time. Now, when I started that, I spoke to David Davis about it, who was the Brexit Secretary, to make sure that in having those discussions with Michel Barnier and his team, I wouldn't be impeding the government's negotiations. And David Davis and I agreed how that would operate, and he actually facilitated the start of those discussions. But we've been having those discussions for 2 years, but we haven't negotiated anything. Because both we and Michel Barnier recognised that we were not negotiating with him. We were simply exploring with him what options the EU might be open to or not. And so not only do we not want to craft a document, but I'm as sure as I can be that Michel Barnier wouldn't have countenanced agreeing a document with us, because he would and did say frequently, I'm not negotiating with you, I'm negotiating with the UK government.
Thank you. You expressed your disappointment earlier about, you said that you'd been invited to talks with the government too late, and you described that as a big mistake. At what point should you have been invited to talks with the government about the negotiating strategy? I
think the Prime Minister should have brought Parliament in at the very start. The referendum result answered one question, which is, do more people want to leave the EU than stay in the EU? It didn't answer the very next question, which was, if we're to leave, what should the future relationship be? That question permits of many different answers. One answer might be economically and close to the EU, operating very similar provisions to those in place at the moment. Another might be very distant to the EU and looking elsewhere for our trade, and therefore reorientating the whole approach that we have to global trade. They're two obviously very different approaches, and I thought and think that that was a question which the whole of Parliament should have been involved in answering, not just the Prime Minister. And when the Prime Minister drew up her red lines in the autumn of 2016, as I understand it, she did so without consulting the Cabinet, certainly without consulting Parliament, and I think that was an error. And I know it's easy to say this in retrospect, but had the Prime Minister brought Parliament into this and got consensus as to the way forward, she would have had a lot more authority in the negotiations, in my view, because, as we've already heard, one of the questions the EU has constantly asked of the Prime Minister is, have you got a majority to get this through? Had that consensus been built, she might have had that majority. By the time we got to the talks, it was far too late, because the withdrawal agreement was already signed and sealed and locked, and therefore it was, virtually impossible to have a meaningful discussion about how any of that might have been changed.
Thank you. What discussions have you had with the devolved administrations in preparing your thinking about what a Labour-led withdrawal agreement might look like?
Well, it varies. In Wales, extensive discussions, obviously, because we're in government in Wales, and therefore there's discussion going all the time. As you know, I go to Scotland from time to time, certainly discuss with our Scottish colleagues, and when I do, I try to have discussions with the Scottish Government, and the same in Northern Ireland's a different kettle of fish, obviously.
You seem to be saying, though, that you have discussions within the Labour family, and occasionally you'll step outside that. Aren't you making the same mistake the Prime Minister made of talking to your own party and not having, for example, not having discussions with a government that you'll need a legislative consent motion from before your plans can be implemented?
I don't think so, but I mean, I'm very happy to have discussions with anybody about how we advance and make progress, and therefore, if there's meetings that you think I ought to be going to or should be invited to, I'm very happy to take those invitations up.
Thank you. I'll certainly pass on that message to my colleagues in the Scottish Government. It struck me that when both yourself and David were talking about the sticking points between the agreement that the government had reached and what Labour might have wanted, ending free movement of people wasn't a sticking point. It wasn't one of the three problem areas. In your 2017 election manifesto, you supported the anti-free movement of people. Would you expect that to be in your manifesto if there's an election this year?
Well, obviously we'll have to see what's in the manifesto if there's an election later this year. Yesterday we announced the position of that whatever outcome is now arrived at by an incoming Prime Minister, that should be subject to a referendum. In that referendum, Remain should be an option, and the Labour Party will campaign for Remain.
Are you satisfied that you understand how fundamentally important free movement of people is to Scotland? Do you understand that no Brexit that ends free movement of people will ever be acceptable to the overwhelming majority of Scotland, and probably to the overwhelming majority of the Scottish Parliament? Are you sure you actually understand how deep that feeling goes in Scotland?
I've done my best. I've been to Scotland a number of times to discuss it with various communities up there, with businesses up there. I've had meetings with Scottish businesses down here, and they've impressed on me that very, very strongly. I've had discussions with our own colleagues in Scotland. I've had discussions with SNP colleagues about what happens, what the position is. So I'm happy to have any further discussions.
Okay. We are going to need to move on, because Seema wants to ask a question. Well, if it's very quick, yes, because you've had a goodly time, of course.
Jeremy Corbyn has repeatedly said it's got to be a Brexit for jobs. Could you describe a Brexit that would be good for the Scottish economy? Better for the Scottish economy than being in the EU?
Well, I think the question Jeremy Corbyn was addressing was, if we're to leave with a deal, what are the essential components of that deal? And what we argued for is a deal that had a customs union with the EU and single market alignment. And I think that those are two necessary characteristics of any deal that would be as protective as possible of the economy and therefore of jobs.
It's still not as good as the deal we have just now.
Well, I voted and I campaigned for Remain, but I don't think that allows me to dodge the question, which is, if we are to leave, what are the features of a deal that would be acceptable to the Labour Party?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for coming to give evidence to us today, Sir Keir. I wonder if you could just share some perspectives from the discussions you've been having around the country, they may have changed as well in terms of what's being said to you as you consult. What would your assessment be of the drivers of Brexit and the expectations of citizens now about what would be different or better after we leave the European Union?
I think there are a number of drivers, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I voted to remain, and therefore describing the drivers for other people is fraught with difficulties. I think the phrase "take back control" was very powerful. I think it spoke to people in a way that made them ask real questions about whether they had enough control over their lives on a number of different levels, and I think many people answered that question no, because they, in my view, think that the political and economic system, the status quo if you like, is not working for them, and I think they've got a point about that. I question whether leaving the EU is going to answer those concerns, and that's why one of the tragedies of the last 3 years is that we haven't spent any time in Parliament addressing those core issues, regional investment, infrastructure, public services, you name it, because all of our energy and time has been sucked up talking about Brexit.
Would it be a concern then that we may end up leaving the EU, but it would not actually solve the issues that people had voted Brexit to help deliver?
Yeah, I'm worried about that. And what I found interesting at the end of the Article 50 exercise running up to the 29th of March was that by that stage, not even the Prime Minister was really arguing that she's got a very good deal that would be great for the future of the country. She was simply saying this is the best I can put before Parliament. And so the argument that this is going to be a great benefit has receded over the 3 years, it seems to me.
Well, could I just ask you one final question? I'm conscious of time as well. That if there was a further attempt at cross-party talks before the 31st of October, what would the Labour Party's position be and any preconditions to take part?
My approach to cross-party talks is if there's a serious invitation from the government to have cross-party talks, we should engage in them and obviously see what the government seeks to achieve from it. I think, as I said in the talks in April and May, my own assessment is that for many colleagues in the PLP, any deal is unlikely to be acceptable unless it comes with the lock of a confirmatory vote. And therefore, if the purpose of any talks is to build a sustained majority, it has to take into account that for many Labour MPs, that is now a condition that they would attach to any deal. It actually helps unlock it in a curious way, because you don't have to agree every detail of a deal if it's going to then be subject to the lock of a confirmatory vote, and that is one way to break the impasse.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much. Okay. As I think Peter Grant's already referred to, in the Labour manifesto in 2017, it was clear that the Labour Party supported the end of free movement. Is that not the case?
Well, what we actually said was that freedom of movement will end when we leave the EU, which is perfectly true. We then set out that we would seek fair and managed migration, and so we weren't advocating the end of free movement. We were simply stating the fact, which is true, which is if you leave the EU, free movement ends.
But that's not quite the case, is it? Because you could leave the EU and remain in the EEA, and free movement would continue.
Well, that's perfectly true, I accept that.
So, but in effect, by accepting that free movement would end, the Labour Party was saying that we would leave the single market, because that's one of the four freedoms of the single market. Therefore, if you're not having free movement, you've left the single market.
Well, this goes over what now seems like old ground.
No, it is quite important.
Well, it is. The only members of the single market are members of the EU. If you want to...
That's not actually the case.
Yes, it is. If you leave the EU, you're not a member of the single market. You can be very close to it, as Norway is, through the EEA, but they're not members in the sense of voting members of the single market. They're outside the single market, and they're buffering up and aligning very closely. But they're not members if membership connotes voting rights.
Right, okay. So I accept that there are slight differences, but Norway would consider themselves, as would Iceland and Liechtenstein, members of the single market. Switzerland would not, clearly, because that's a slightly different arrangement. But anyway, leaving that one aside, it's clear that in the Labour Party manifesto, that's what was said, that we would be leaving, we would not be having freedom of movement. Now, it was also said very clearly that you would be looking for a customs union arrangement, and I fully accept that. So what I've wanted to try and understand, and I think this is what Mr. Kinnock was trying to drive at, is where were the really substantive differences between where the government ended up and where the Labour Party ended up? And were they not, given that there were negotiations about workers' rights, environmental protections and things like that, which I fully accept were also in the Labour Party manifesto quite clearly, and in my view quite rightly, would there not have been a position to compromise which would have enabled the Labour Party, the majority of the Labour Party, to support the position as it was at the end of March?
The fundamental difference, just to take the customs union as an example, was that we have argued for a comprehensive customs union and therefore a customs union with the EU 27. And I discussed this with Michel Barnier and his team, that would involve us having a say or some influence over trade policy, but we would be negotiating trade agreements alongside the EU. Now, we went for that model for three reasons. One, we are convinced that that's the only effective way to protect manufacturing, and pretty well every manufacturing business I've talked to in the last 3 years has impressed that on me, that just how important it is for them to stay in the customs union. We adopted that arrangement because we took the view that there is no way of keeping the arrangements in Northern Ireland as they are unless a customs union with the EU is part of the arrangement. And I worked in Northern Ireland for 5 years, and I went there frequently to discuss this, and I've never heard a credible argument that it's possible to keep the border as it is without being in a customs union. We also did it because we felt and do feel that we are likely to strike better deals if we do it alongside the EU than we are on our own. And the evidence of the last 2 years doesn't suggest that countries are coming to us first to give better trade deals than they are to the EU. It seems to be the other way around. So there were that was our position. The government's position, by contrast, was obviously that if they could get the benefits of the customs union, they wanted them, but they also wanted an independent trade policy. And they realised that was a difficult ask of the EU that had not been agreed. That's why it's not in the political declaration. But that's what they wanted to achieve. So they're pretty fundamentally different positions. What we were exploring is whether there was common ground between those two positions. But in the end, the government said, no, the independent trade policy is worth more to us than agreeing a customs union. So for one of the discussions we had was, if you try to get the benefits of customs union and independent trade policy, and the EU, you can't reach agreement with the EU, what for you, government, is your default position? Do you default to an independent trade policy, or do you default to a customs union? If the answer had been we'd default to a customs union, that would have led the discussion into a different place. But the argument, and I'm not criticising the government, was no, actually we go the other way. So we were trying to see where there was common ground, but in the end, as we worked through what would happen if then, what would happen if this, what would happen if that, it was clear that there would have been a divergence of views on that.
Thank you, I understand that. But given that the withdrawal agreement meant that until December 2020, with the possible extension to up to December 2022, the United Kingdom would have remained within the customs union and indeed the single market, and a general election must be held prior to, well, obviously by June 2022. So there was, even within the withdrawal agreement, the opportunity for, at a general election, the Labour Party to make clear its own policy and to be voted in on its own policy, which would have been remaining in a customs union. The only caveat would have been that that extension to 2022 would have to be effectively guaranteed rather than the possibility. Would I not be right in saying that? That would have given the people the chance to say, yes, we agree with your policy of a permanent customs union.
Well, the position of the government in the talks, I think, to the public, is that they want the final agreement agreed before 2022. That was their position in the talks, and it was the position the Prime Minister always held, that she wanted the deal to be done before the next general election. And therefore the talks were premised on the government's position saying we want to have concluded the negotiation and to have signed a deal before the general election. And I understand that from their point of view, but that was the premise upon which they were advancing the talks.
I see. I suppose my final question is, do you, given the huge importance of these discussions of what is happening at the moment and the potential consequences, do you see there to be more flexibility if the government were to show some indication of flexibility in its position, whether the current government or obviously the new government in a couple of weeks' time? Do you see more flexibility on the Labour side so that an agreement could be reached which would command the majority of the House of Commons? Or is it all dependent upon whatever happens being subject to a further public vote, i.e. a second referendum?
Look, I mean, as David Lidington said, both sides went into this in good faith and maintained that good faith throughout. And I have a lot of personal respect for David Lidington, in particular as the leader of that team and in any event. And we, we're both conscious of the desire of many people across the country to break the impasse. And therefore, if there was an offer of further talks, then of course we would look at that and explore what was possible. And we'd have to see how flexible the government was prepared to be, which is what we did last time. So I don't know whether that will come about. It depends who wins the race to become the Conservative Prime Minister. But I can't envisage circumstances in which we would say that we wouldn't have further talks if the government proposed such talks, and we would enter them in the same spirit, which is to see whether it's possible to find a way through.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Pat McFadden.
Just one question. Keir, it's the same one that I asked David Lidington, really, which is about the unity of the UK. You talked quite extensively in an earlier exchange about the security implications of leaving without a deal. We've debated quite a lot the economic implications of leaving without a deal. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to put on record your view on this question of the implications for the Union. Do you think they have been underplayed? And how big a risk do you think leaving without a deal poses to the unity of the UK?
I don't think... I think the risks are real, and I agree with a lot of what David said about there are underlying tensions and underlying reasons why that risk is there. But I think Brexit simply adds to those risks. He answered pretty fully on Scotland and on Wales, and I would agree with his analysis. In Northern Ireland, what I've observed is that the Brexit debate has morphed into a debate about the island of Ireland, and it's introduced the idea of accelerating some of the mechanisms under the Good Friday Agreement for the unification of Ireland, and that's been extremely unsettling, because under the Good Friday Agreement there are proposals, there are provisions in place for the island of Ireland with carefully calibrated steps if Ireland decides to go down that road. And what Brexit's done is to introduce a sort of acceleration of that and therefore driven a debate that wasn't there before in Ireland. And I think, in addition to what he said to Scotland and Wales, I would add that as an additional risk, and that is very Brexit related. It's Brexit that's caused that.
Okay, and lastly, well, you hadn't indicated, but Richard had. Well, usually you catch the chairs. I bet I will, despite. Of course, I'll bring you in, but Richard Graham was next.
Thank you very much. Sir Keir, it seems to me you've had an incredibly difficult task in trying to formulate a policy that can hold two very separate wings of the Labour Party together, those who strongly voted Remain in the metropolitan cities and those who in the North and the Midlands especially voted Leave. And clearly the best way to try and do that has been to fudge a position that doesn't entirely satisfy everyone and isn't particularly clear. What surprised me, I think, is that the difference between your stated position for a comprehensive customs union and what was effectively in the third attempt at the withdrawal agreement bill doesn't seem to me so far away as to warrant risking the possibility of no deal.
Firstly, let me take on the challenge of fudge. The position we took was that we, as a party, campaigned to remain and reform the EU, when the result went the other way, we accepted the result, and we took the view that that required us to trigger Article 50 to allow the Prime Minister to start the negotiations.
But it did more than that,
just hear me out.
Because your manifesto did commit you to respecting the results of the referendum.
Just hear me out, just so that I can put this in its proper perspective. What we did was to indicate, when we triggered Article 50, what we would expect of any deal when it came back, and then during the 2 years, we spelt that out in more detail about a comprehensive customs union and single market alignment, and we worked on putting in the safety valve of a meaningful vote. When the deal came back, it didn't come anywhere near, and it wasn't just on the customs union. It was also on the single market, it was also on the agencies, and the political declaration. I was quite shocked when I read it as to just how thin it was, and it was a menu of options rather than anything that indicated where we were going to end up. So the deal having gone down, the cross-party talks having failed, the position we announced yesterday in relation to a second referendum recognises where we are in the process and that there isn't a deal that can go through that's going to be acceptable to the Labour Party. So it's actually, put in that context, you can at least understand, you may agree or disagree with the steps along the way, but that's how the position has evolved. I don't hide from the fact that there are differences of opinion in my party about that, or that I haven't been trying to hold those views together insofar as I'm able to do so, because I think it's important to respect both sides in this and to try and hold the Labour Party together in it. But I don't want you to be left with the idea that in the end the only thing between us and the government was the customs union, because we were a part on the single market, we were a part on agencies, we were a part on workplace rights, and this was a real problem because the Withdrawal Act treated workplace rights wholly differently to other aspects. So on sort of consumer rights and on procurement, you do have in the withdrawal agreement dynamic alignment during the course of the withdrawal arrangements. For workplace rights, they're frozen and without the enforcement mechanisms. So there were many things that we disagreed with the government on, and that in particular was a problem because the government had baked in a provision on workplace rights into the withdrawal agreement. That was a political choice they made, that they wouldn't seek dynamic alignment of workplace rights because they could have got it if they'd asked for it. And we were trying to explore with them how we got round the fact that they'd baked in what we thought was the wrong approach in the withdrawal agreement. So the idea that it was just the customs arrangement, I think, is wrong. There was
but can much I bring more you to back it than to that. The central point? Because some people listening to this might conclude that that was a very elegant, lawyerly way of not really answering the question. In your manifesto for the 2017 election, you said, the Labour Party said, we will respect the referendum results. And those members of the Labour Party and Labour supporters in my constituency who voted to leave would, I think, have huge difficulty in reconciling the respect for the result of the referendum to leave the European Union with your current position, which is to have a second referendum. On the ballot paper they received and on the advice they had from the government, it was very clear, what you decide, we will implement. No second referendum.
No,
how do you explain that to them?
Well, it's very important to read the whole of the manifesto. We said we respect the outcome of the referendum, but we will not countenance no deal.
But this isn't countenancing no deal. We're talking about a deal that's 3 times been on the table, and we're all hoping, or many of us are hoping, that there will be another deal on the table. What the Labour Party's current position is, regardless
if you
of
let me
deal
finish
or
the
no
answer,
deal,
I would have dealt with that.
You want a second referendum.
What we said in our manifesto, I was about to finish the answer, and then your further question would have been necessary.
Yeah.
What we said was we do not accept no deal, and we don't accept the government's red lines. And we made that very clear, and we would negotiate a different kind of deal. So we spelt out that we didn't agree with the government's red lines in our manifesto. So nobody voting Labour in 2017 could possibly have thought that the Labour Party was going to vote through a deal with the Prime Minister's current red lines, because we've made absolutely clear we weren't going to do that.
Somebody who voted for the Labour Party in 2017, and there were quite a lot in my constituency, would have assumed that you were going to respect the result of the referendum and leave the European Union. And you're now telling them there's going to have to be a second referendum, whatever the deal put in front of them is.
Well, that's largely because the government's made a pig's ear of the negotiations.
We've
got to a position where there isn't a deal that can go through. And we have to deal with the circumstances as we find them. I can't remember whether you voted for the deal or not, and I really don't know, but very many Conservatives didn't. Therefore, there isn't a deal that's going through. That's a failure of the negotiations, and when the negotiations fail at the end of the exercise, parties have to react to that. But the Labour Party said in its manifesto it wasn't going to vote for a deal with those red lines.
Okay. And finally,
you're very kind.
I am. Peter Buck.
You haven't done that normally when you look at me and say, just that, sir. That's very, very kind. And obviously we have to 6 o'clock, I'm sure. But, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to... There was one or two things, Sir Keir, you said that I didn't quite follow the logic through. You made it very clear of your dislike of no deal. And you talked about crashing out or driving over the cliff, and you gave examples why no deal will be disastrous for the country. And I understand your view on that. But we were in the same lobby on 3 occasions voting against the government's withdrawal agreement. Now, I have no fear of a no deal, and the logic was, if there could not be an agreement, we would finish up with no deal, and that, in fact, may be where we're heading for now. So why, on 3 occasions, did you vote against what you would both absolutely agree was not a good deal, but it removed the uncertainty of a no deal if you'd supported it? And there weren't many Conservatives that voted against. I think there were 28 Eurosceptics. So it wasn't many Conservatives. And with Labour...
On the third vote?
On the third vote, yes. And so it was entirely possible to carry that withdrawal agreement, and the no deal would have been removed from the equation.
Yeah. On that logic, the Labour Party should have voted for any deal that was put before them. And the Prime Minister said, just to follow her mantra, it's my deal or no deal. It's my deal or no deal. It's my deal or no deal. Her deal then went down. She then said, I'll have cross-party talks to see if I can arrange her over at a different deal. So the proposition that this was the only deal that could ever be negotiated or agreed was blown as soon as she said, do you want cross-party talks? Because she then said, well, what about changing this deal then? So this idea that this is a fixed deal, nothing can be changed, it's this deal or no deal, which was the mantra, and wrong in principle, it seems to me, was blown out of the water the moment the Prime Minister, having lost the first vote, didn't say, I'm now preparing for no deal, but said, I'm going to talk to people about a different kind of deal. And she did it, as I understand it, with her own side, and she did it with all other parties, and then we went to the cross-party talks. So the idea that this was the only deal that could ever be negotiated or ever been agreed was wrong.
But you were... I guess, Mr. Chairman, the implication is that you would agree that some deals, i.e. the Prime Minister's one, was worse than risking the possibility of a no deal.
No. I thought that Firstly, I didn't think that this Prime Minister would take us out without a deal. And I thought that because when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, this Prime Minister was Home Secretary, and I had worked with her on serious terrorist cases and security cases, and I knew she knew the implications. And although she said my deal or no deal, I actually, from my knowledge of her, thought that her deep sense of duty would not allow her to do that, because she would know the risk she was exposing the nation to, and I didn't think she would do it. And I was right about that, because on the day she lost the first vote, as you'll remember, she got up to the dispatch box after the vote and didn't say, I'm now preparing for no deal. She did say, I'm now prepared to have discussions across the House. So my judgment that she wasn't actually going to take us out without a deal was right. It was further borne out by the fact that although we seized the order paper and passed a law with Oliver Letwin and Yvette Cooper to force an extension, or at least force the application of an extension, the Prime Minister already decided to do so by the time we got there. So that doubly reinforced my view that this Prime Minister was not going to take us out without a deal, whatever she said about that. She actually changed her language as well going into the March votes, and it became obvious to me that she wasn't actually going to do that. And quite right too.
But you would agree that the European Union has made it very clear that they're not going to change the withdrawal agreement?
That's what they've said consistently since November of last year.
And I don't think this is a wrong position for you to take, but it would seem to me that all along you were driving at trying to keep us in the European Union, and now it is the official policy, as I understand, or you're going to campaign for Remain. So we've now got to a situation, and you've very cleverly got to this situation, where the Labour Party is now, I guess, the official Remain party, and it will be the Conservatives that they'll Leave party. Was that always your intention, to drive it in this way, to try and keep us in the European Union?
No, I mean, anybody who's observed what's gone on in the Labour Party and the position we've adopted will know very well we've had very intense discussions about what a deal should look like, including voting on things like the customs union and single market. What has happened is that as the negotiations have failed and failed and failed again, the prospect now of a deal going through that could possibly be satisfactory has gone down, and in the Labour Party that has meant that more and more colleagues here and members across the country think that the right thing to do now is for any deal that's arrived at, or no deal, to be put to a referendum where Remain is an option and we'll campaign for Remain. But that wasn't the position a year ago. The position a year ago was an intense discussion in the Labour Party about the customs union and single market. It was only when the talks really began to fail that more colleagues were driven to the conclusion that the only way now to break the impasse is a second referendum.
My final question, sir. David Lidington said he's not losing any sleep about the possibility of him becoming Prime Minister. Are you losing any sleep about the possibility of you becoming Prime Minister?
No.
Well, that's a very clear answer. Keir, can I, on behalf of the committee, thank you very much indeed for your evidence today. And for the record, from the Chair, I noticed no hysteria in any of the evidence that was given to this committee this afternoon.
Thank you.
Order, order.